everyone. So I'm going to open the meeting. Can we start with the election of the chair? Can we have nominations, please?
Can I nominate Councillor Smerton, Chris Smerton?
Have we got a seconder? And a show of hands. Okay, that's Councillor Smerton as chair of the committee. In his absence, I'll move straight on to election of vice chair. So can I have nominations? Can we have a second of Councillor Diggins? Show of hands. And that's Councillor Diggins as vice chair for the year, and I'll hand over to her now.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome. And I'm going to ask you to bear with me for two reasons. First, it's obviously my first time chairing this, and secondly, I am recovering from sort of the extended remix of COVID, so my brain's still a bit frazzled. I'm no longer contagious, I'm just exhausted. So next, I'm going to hand over to Alice to read out the apologies and substitutions.
Thank you. So we've got apologies from Councillor Coyne, and we've got Councillor Hunt subbing for her. Councillor Ross Smith has sent apologies, and we've got Councillor Altaf Khan subbing, and Councillor Smoten has sent his apologies, and we've got Councillor Sanderson, and Councillor Carrace has also said he'll be late.
Raise something is
What is this about?
Substitutions.
Okay, quickly.
It should have been my name in full council, so it's a mistake. So I am the permanent member. That's why it has to go to the next council again. Andrew can explain that.
Thank you for clarifying. If anyone's got any questions, but I imagine that'll be resolved next full council. So fantastic. And then if anyone's got any declarations of interest for any of the items on the agenda today, you can disclose anything as it comes up as well.
Is it called NPI? Non-pecuniary interests on waterways and bathing quality. I'm involved with end sewage pollution campaign.
Brilliant. So can I turn to you to just clarify exactly what that doesn't necessarily have a bearing on whether you can participate, does it?
No. You're fine to stay in the room, and that's okay.
Fantastic. Any others? Not seeing any hands. Obviously, if something arises in the discussion, just put up your hand. And then chair's announcements, which I have none. And then looking at the minutes of the last meeting, if anyone's got any clarifications or anything they want to raise before we go to approval for those. Not seeing any hands. So can I just have a quick show of hands to say that everyone's happy to approve those? Fantastic. I think that's unanimous. And then I think we're moving, originally on the agenda we had the operating principles next, but actually I think ignore that. We were going to swap things around, but I think the person who's going to be presenting the Child Poverty Review Group isn't actually here yet. So we're going to clarify, I think she's in the operating theatre. So, and so we're going to move the operating principles and do that first. So this is largely, we're just approving these, I guess, subject to anything that anyone very specifically wants to raise. But the other thing we have to, I think, start thinking about is whether there's, given the changes to company scrutiny's panel and how that's not going to be taking as much time, we've got sort of the capacity to either have another review group or standing panel. It's not something we're going to approve this meeting, but it might be something that if anyone's got any suggestions, they might want to raise. But I'd suggest, I can come in. Yeah, that would be actually very helpful. I'm going to pass to Alice.
Thank you. So this report is asking the committee to establish the arrangements for scrutiny for the coming year. So it's similar to other years. There's been a change to the shareholder arrangements. So previously shareholder and company scrutiny panel met separately, but what we're proposing to do is join up those meetings. So there'll be a joint meeting, which company scrutiny panel will be in the room and doing sort of live scrutiny. And that obviously frees up some capacity for the scrutiny officer to either do another review group or another standing panel, capacity for up to 5 meetings. So we basically need a steer from the committee on what they might like to do. And proposals would come to the next meeting in July to establish a new review group or standing panel. Also looking at Appendix B of that item, just to note that we're suggesting that we move the housing and homeless panel if it's re-established, as there's no business for July. So we're suggesting that that might be moved to September so that the panel can consider the draft housing, homelessness and rough sleeping strategy going to Cabinet. I can find a date if the committee is happy to change that date. And also just to remind you that for the work plan, we need ideas from Scrutiny for Scrutiny commissioned reports to be sent to Democratic Services before the July meeting to inform the work plan going forward.
Are there any questions or points anyone would like to raise on those recommendations? Yeah, Lucy, or Councillor Pegg, sorry.
Yeah, just to say on the idea of new panels, I think it would be great to have a climate and environment panel to scrutinise the increasing amount of policy coming out of the council and cabinet on climate and environment and whether it's actually living up to what it's meant to be doing. I suppose formally have to bring that to the next meeting.
Yes, I think Alice has noted that down so we can discuss that properly next meeting. But obviously if anyone's got any ideas before the July meeting, if you just pop that in an email as well. So if there's anything else on the forward plan or anything, not seeing any hands. So is everyone happy to sort of approve those recommendations in a block? So everyone in favour? Fantastic. Okay. So I think we might move to, unless anyone's got any objections, we might move to the waterways update next, because I think is that okay, but yeah. Okay, so what we might do is we're going to take the we've got a public speaker on the Child Poverty Review Group report, so we'll take that now, and then we'll either move on to the rest of that discussion, or we'll jump ahead to the waterways report and jump back, just depending on when Councillor Jafari Mabini is here. So I'm going to hand over to Sue Tanner from Oxford and District Poverty Action Group, I think. I've probably garbled that name because I did it off the top of my head, but I'll let you introduce yourself. So that's 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's Oxford and District Action on Child Poverty. We used to be called Child Poverty Action Group, but we had to change the name. Anyway, I'm speaking on their behalf because we wanted to say how much we welcomed the work of the review, and in particular, this very impressive report. And we hope very much that the Scrutiny Committee will endorse it and its recommendations. We as a group are very aware already of the City Council's existing policies which support households living in poverty, and congratulate you all on maintaining them in spite of budget cuts. For example, the council tax reduction scheme, which is very unusual in this country now, sadly. Financial support to the advice centres, which you're continuing to maintain, the Oxford Living Wage, and provision of social housing. And there are others, of course. We do hope that you will endorse the recommendations, but in particular, we want to highlight recommendations 11 and 12, which is consideration of introducing a socio-economic duty on the council. Recommendations 17 and 18, the establishment of a Poverty Truth Commission, and especially one, we welcome the suggestion that it should hear from young people about their experience of living in poverty. There is nothing like lived experience for informing policy. Recommendation 20, that instead of vouchers, people in need should be given cash wherever possible. And finally, recommendation 5, that funding to advice centres should be inflation proofed, at least while inflation is running at such a high level. We welcome some of the other suggestions, for example, working with market traders to make surplus food available to those in need, and with the university colleges to make recreational facilities available to local residents. And the group would be very happy to give whatever help we can, for example, in the work of the Poverty Truth Commission, if you do decide, if the council decides to go ahead with it. That's all I wanted to say. Thanks very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to come and address the committee. I think given we don't have the chair of the review group with us yet, I'm going to suggest, unless anyone objects, that we move on to the waterways report and then jump back to that when she's here, so we can have a full discussion on it. Not seeing any objections, so fantastic. So I think, sorry, bear with me 1 second. So I'm going to hand over to Michael Woods to introduce the report. Oh, would you mind just jumping over to that seat and then popping the mic on? Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, Michael Woods. I'm the Oxford Waterways Coordinator, and this is just to give an update on, based on previous scrutiny committee's recommendations from November 2020. This is just to give an update on what the Waterways project has been working on since those sets of recommendations. So I did circulate around the paper, giving an update on all the individual recommendations and what currently is still being worked on and what has shifted in the priorities of the role. The role since the previous post holder left. It was identified that we had a series of health and safety issues along the assets on our waterways, which has taken a higher priority to rectify and sort since in the last 18 months. So the main focus of the role now for the short term is looking at how we can set up an asset management system to put in place for the waterways. Currently, a lot of the data, the land ownership records we have are quite fragmented. We spend quite a significant amount of officer time trying to work out who owns what. And we're trying to get a system in place that has clarity on everything that we do own, and we can definitively say, yeah, what is ours, what is not. We've also been working on the designated bathing water site, which we've now achieved for Wolfcote Mill Stream. So that was designated by DEFRA in May 2022. Bathing water status means that the Environment Agency now monitor through the bathing season from the start of May to the end of September, testing for fecal matter. So the purpose of the designation is to monitor water quality, but not necessarily promote swimming at that spot. So we're ascertaining what the pollution levels are in the water. We're making people aware of the risks around wild swimming. That doesn't necessarily mean that the Wolfcote Mill Stream section is currently fit for swimming for people. There's some other streams of work which we're currently looking at. So stuff around moorings and boating. We're working with potential new housing developments such as Redbridge to look further into feasibility studies of whether additional moorings, whether they're community-owned moorings or moorings owned by the council, whether they are applicable. So there is some feasibility work, but currently nothing set in stone for the additionality of moorings along there. And the end section of this report gives an outline of all the stuff that has been achieved and completed since the last scrutiny, but also work that is now being deemed priority and is currently ongoing. So yeah, Appendix 1 within the report gives an overall summary as to what the Waterways Post is currently focused and prioritising.
Thank you very much. I think if we take sort of any questions to start with, and I think the cabinet member and executive director are also available for questions. So going round, I'll take Councillor Tidball first.
Thank you for this report, and it's a really, really good paper and builds very well on the work that Tim had previously started. I'm particularly pleased to see the recommendations around Redbridge moorings and improving the quality of provision there, and also the work to look at community ownership or as well as an option. I think that's a really good piece of work, and we should pursue that. I have a couple of comments and questions. So I know that one of the complexities, having had a number of conversations with Tim, who had the role previously, about this around the riparian ownership and actually the role of the universities. And I just wondered, first of all, whether there's any sense of timescale, because I know this has already gone on for many, many years, and actually all the while that we're basically basing the ownership on principles of Roman law, because that's how it works. It's that archaic, that we are in a situation actually where parts of our beautiful waterways are deteriorating, and that's affecting where people are living. It's also affecting antisocial behaviour and our wildlife and biodiversity. And so I really think it would be useful to know what other key partners like the university, because much of the issues, from what as I'm aware, are the college land that buttresses ours and the environment agencies, and them basically trying to create wiggle room around when their boundary ends, so they don't have to take on any liability. She says gently, but so it would be really useful to know what you're doing with the university, because I think there's a serious question about them having a role here and bringing some funding to the table to support the role. And I really would want to see this role taking place long term. The waterways are a really important part of our heritage, community areas, and biodiversity, and a really great way for us to navigate around the city accessibly. So that's one question. My other questions are less long-winded. It would be great to see more recommendations in here about how we improve accessibility for wheelchair users and those with young children and needing to use prams to access those waterways, so that we can avoid roads and other high traffic areas. And there's not much in here on that, so I'd love to see a bit more on that. And then my other question is really around the end of the document and financial implications. There, unless I've missed something, but it would be really useful to know what kind of budget bid actually you'd be wanting members to be requesting during the budget round. And I don't really have a sense of the scale. I mean, many of us could sort of assume what the officer salary and other on costs would include, but actually there are quite serious bits of infrastructure work that need to happen. I know that we'll hear more from an asset review, but that could take a long time. So we do really need a better sense of what budget is needed to get to the point that we want to get to. And you look at places like Birmingham, who've done incredible investment and rejuvenation of their waterways over the years, and you know, that's involved huge amounts of spending. But really, we need a financial strategy for this and to move it forward, because lots of very complex issues have kind of burbled away and ticked on for a long time, and this should be something that we are holding up and celebrating as a really important part of our city. So I'd like to hear more about budget as well.
Can I hand over the second question to Mish, please?
Yes, happy to. I mean, on the point about well, actually, it was more the third. Let me pick up the budget point, because I mean, there are doubtless going to be a number of competing priorities. So as a member of the corporate management team, if you're asking for recommendations about budget bids, we'd have to look at that in the round. I think I'd have to advise that. There are undoubtedly some areas where there may be some urgent requirement because from a safety point of view, and Michael sort of set that out initially, which is where the sort of core immediate focus of some of the work has been, and you know, where we may need to do some urgent repairs to ensure that we're covered legally. But beyond that, you could spend a lot of money on our waterways. So yeah, I think it has to be looked against all the other calls on budget.
Before I hand back to Michael, I guess pick up the first few questions. Do you mind just quickly switching Michael? Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So back to the first question around liaison with the universities. there's been, since Tim's left, there has been limited communication with them whilst we focused on the health and safety elements to this role. But that's not to say it's not something that we do want to pick up moving forward. So there is certainly scope there. And part of the asset, the land ownership piece of work we're working on, where we can compile a database, is we can actually clarify what is ours, what's not ours. We can then work from there to look at where could be suitable for additional provision for facilities for moorers. The only other thing to factor into this is we've had conversations with the Environment Agency in the past, and along the main Thames Channel, we'd never get permanent moorings or facilities along the Thames navigational highway. So we'd need to look at potential sites off the main channel.
I'll just go to Marie quickly. Is this a point of clarification to what Michael's? Yeah, okay.
I in terms of the audit, I suppose it's an incredibly intricate piece of work, and I guess I would probably want to recommend that there was actually a prioritization done around the areas which needs to have targeted improvement and establishing ownership for those places, because otherwise it's going to be a huge piece of work. And then anyway, in the meantime, those certain areas will have deteriorated. So I just wonder, I think it would be really helpful to have, a prioritization of the sections that really do need work for social behaviour reasons, access reasons, biodiversity reasons, need some priority, and looking at the ownership and untangling that there, and also utilising that to leverage in the partnership working with the university. And I wonder on that last point whether that can be a recommendation from Scrutiny that we would want to see the university and other adjacent landowners to come to the table and be part of this piece of work, not least in terms of funding and thinking kind of how can we utilize growth board funding. So it is a clarification, but it's also a bit of a encouragement to kind of prioritize a couple of things.
Can I suggest that we take that? I think Alice has written it down, and we sort of work that up into a proper recommendation, either in a minute or I guess wording wise via email after the meeting's finished, if you're happy with that. Yeah. Fantastic. Could I have hands up again? I think it was Councillor Belly Summers next. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for the report. It's about the bathing status at the Volvercourt Mill. So basically, I have lots of friends who swim in the river. We know that the river, the Thames Valley, Thames water is discharging 10 hours per week of untreated sewage in the water. So what would happen if your agency found out that the water was unsafe at the Volvercourt Mill? Would you have any leverage to put pressure onto Thames Water?
So we have set up a working group between the City Council, the Environment Agency, and Thames Water. So there is now ongoing discussions as this moves forward. Designation is a 5-year project. And the data that is captured will be reviewed at the end of this bathing season. There probably needs to be some more work to ascertain exactly where these pollution sources are coming from, because between the nearest sewage discharge point, which is up at the Cassington Mill stream, there's lots of other potential pollution factors between there and beyond there that could be affecting the water quality. So it will be ongoing dialogue with the Environment Agency and Thames Water to look at investigating further whether it is just Thames Water that are responsible, or whether there are other factors at play. The onus comes down to the Environment Agency to speak with Thames Water and lobby them into upgrading their infrastructure. That's something the council can support, but we don't have powers to enforce that. Our role within the bathing water designation is to inform the public on the water quality. So we update the public around water quality information. If there are any serious pollution spills, again, we'll get signage up and information out to tell people that the river is not currently fit for swimming in. So that's our role in this designation.
Brilliant. I think, yeah, I'll just pass over.
Just to follow on that, this is what we take it seriously, and I flagged up with Michie that is taking it forward, and we're also looking at advising the Thames Water for the long-term investment so that these problems can be avoided in future.
Could I have hands again for questions? Yeah, I'll go to Councillor Hunt.
I was just going to add my voice to exactly that concern, because what we know from the Guardian article a week ago is there's only one bathing place within Oxford that actually doesn't have dangerously high levels of E. coli in at the moment. And regardless of having a bathing status at Wolvercott, it's all the same water. So my question was about what sort of engagement the City Council has with Thames Water and what sort of leverage we have, because we know certain local authorities in certain parts of England now, people are not paying their bills for wastewater. They're paying for the drinking water, but not for the wastewater collection for exactly this reason. And I think we really need to step up on the reports of exactly what's in the water, because everyone does want to swim. We know that. And to bring them in, ideally, that there should be a recommendation for them to have to come and sit here and take questions from us councillors and not get away with this. You know, what we know is that Thames Water is owned by a Canadian hedge fund. They're completely unaccountable. So we've got to do what we can to bring them into the room.
So is that a sort of a formal recommendation? Okay, brilliant. And I guess, again, we can sort of work out the details of the wording after the meeting in the interest of time. Could I have, I guess if that's a recommendation rather than a question, you happy for me to jump to the next person? Brilliant. Can I have hands again? Sorry. Okay, I'll go to Councillor Sanderson.
And the scrutiny that you're doing on the river, and it's good to see that there will be social media posts, because as we know, there haven't necessarily been as many notifications as we would have liked from Thames Water when there have been sewage overflows. And even now, just because there is bathing water status, as we have seen, there are still high levels of E. coli and fecal matter coming from Cassington and Whitney, and there has been quite a lot of obfuscation, I would say, at the very least. So it's good to have continued scrutiny and discussion with the environment, strong discussion with the Environment Agency to keep putting pressure on the water company.
Yeah. Do you want to come back on that, or?
No, I don't think I've got a comment on that. Yeah, we will continue to have regular catch-ups with both organisations and other organisations where appropriate. So,
yeah, Mish.
I think it's just worth adding that, I mean, Thames Water has sort of accepted a level of responsibility around all this. So it did support the project that has sort of brought the bathing water status about, and it has made public commitments through the media and so forth about reducing the sewage outfalls. So I think it's absolutely appropriate to ask Thames Water to come here and you know, update and so forth. And furthermore, you know, over the course of the coming years, because we're talking about years with the level of infrastructure investment, I dare say, that we are holding them to account and that we will be continuing to record the level of sewage and so forth.
And Councillor Pegg.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about in the section about improving safety for swimmers, it talks about decommissioned bathing sites that are now unsafe and needing repairs. Sounds like fairly urgently. So I want to know, what is the timeline for actually doing anything to make those safer? Because we know that especially places like Long Bridges are definitely being used, even if they are technically decommissioned.
Yeah, so it's work that we're currently undertaking with specialist consultants to come up with potential options and designs to seek funding to rectify. So the likes of Longbridges and Tumbling Bay, each site has now got deteriorating embankments, concrete embankments, which are slipping in. We are aware, whilst we don't promote, we are aware that people do swim at these sites. So it's making sure that if people do choose to enter the water, the infrastructure is safe for them to be able to get in and out. That equally applies if someone were to fall in. That there are safe mechanisms for people to enter and exit the water.
Is there any sort of, is this a question, Mike?
Brief.
Yeah.
Sorry, just briefly, when considering the safety of sites, have we also considered the alternative, whether it be more cost effective in some cases? Well, I'm thinking of one particular case, to decommission them in practice. I may lose a few friends of who are people I know vaguely in saying this about Tumbling Bay, but half of the old site is already full of a flourish, in essence, a flourishing wetland with water plants, and if the rest of it could be turned into something similar, that might be a more cost-effective way of stopping people swimming there than either fencing it off or repairing the concrete embankment. Sorry.
I think regardless of how we manage the actual pools itself, the issue that we have is around the concrete embankments, and they are at risk of slipping in. So the focus, our focus is to rectify those issues, because if someone were to stand on the embankment at the moment, there is a risk around that. So it's mitigating the risks for people actually walking along or being near those embankments rather than specifically for swimming.
I think I saw a hand from Councillor Arshad.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, no, my question is really following up from Councillor Lucy. What she's saying is, what's the timeline for these? Because obviously we're going to be at the peak this summer. So what's the timeline to get things fixed? I mean, I'm just thinking, yeah, that'd be helpful to know, because obviously we've got a duty of care, and how are we going to be relaying the communication out to all our young users and old?
So we have got, so regarding Tumbling Bay, Longbridges, we are working with local community groups, and we have been liaising with the local councillors. There probably needs to be an updated brief now that we've had the elections through, but we are having ongoing conversations with key groups that are using the sites. And we're also looking at the safety equipment that are on those sites as well. So for instance, the ladders, etc. In terms of specifically on timescales, we need to have our options. We need to decide the options on what we do want to move forward with. Part of that is looking at working with groups at Tumbling Bay on how the design of those sites look moving forward. So we are reviewing options at the moment. Where it has been deemed they are an urgent health and safety risk, we have put, for example, we've put Harris fencing up around Tumbling Bay to prevent public access over the winter months. Now that the sites are getting used over the summer, it's popular for picnicking, etc. We're looking at something a bit more low-key to put in place, but still try and prevent slips and trips, etc. But until we have the options decided that we want to move forward with, we still need to secure funding internally for that, because there's no ring fence budget at the moment. I don't know whether Mish has anything to comment on.
I mean, in sort of straightforward terms, I don't think that we're looking at a solution that would be in place this summer. I mean, that's just not reasonable from a timeline perspective. But as Michael has updated, the discussions are live, the options will emerge, and then yes, there is that funding issue, and there are potentially sources of funding that we can sort of pursue, beyond outside of the council.
You've got a clarification, did you say?
Communication on the communication, we'll go out on all the sites on the social media.
Just going to scan around to see if anyone's, because those have mainly been questions, even if we picked up some recommendations. So if anyone's got any recommendations they'd like to raise, I've got one or two, I think, that I pulled together from a few strands in the discussion that I'd like to suggest, one of which is maybe something a bit broad around lobbying. I think we've talked a lot about, I guess, holding Thames Water accountable, but I also think that this is very much also in the hands of the government. So maybe a recommendation about sort of maybe using some of the data that we are collecting to continue to lobby the government to make sure that they are holding water regulators to account and all those kinds of things. And I think I had another one, but it has, and then maybe just a recommendation about making sure that I guess our bathing site policy and our, I guess, other uses of the water, so kind of wildlife, wetland sort of approaches are all joined up and looked at in quite a holistic way. I'm sure that's already been done, but I think it might be useful to put it down as a recommendation, but I'm happy for people to sort of amend those later because they're quite woolly at the moment. Did anyone have anything else they wanted to add? I'm seeing Councillor Hunt and then I think Councillor Sanderson.
Was actually getting Thames Water in the room, was that one of your recommendations? Yes. Oh, fine, sorry.
Actually, yeah, before I go to you, it might be really helpful if I'm just going to turn to Alice and she's going to read out what we've got so far.
So at the minute we'd like to see the universities and adjacent landowners come to the table on part of the piece of work in terms of funding and how we utilise growth funding, and I'll confirm the wording with Councillor Tidball. We've got one to continue to influence Thames Water to come to the table and report on what's in the water. Is that, yeah. And we've got a potential one from Councillor Arshad, updated communication to members on the timelines and social media campaigning to inform on the timelines, lobbying Thames Water and holding them accountable. I think that's the same one that you were saying, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we've gotten about continuing to lobby the government with the data to ensure that they're holding water regulators to account and ensuring that our wildlife and work is being joined up with this work.
Brilliant. I'll go to Councillor Sanderson quickly.
I would like to recommend that, as well as Thames Water, we have experts in the field of waterways, such as, can I recommend a particular person or organisation?
What I'm going to suggest, and I might be wrong in this, is this sounding like it's shaping up to be a bit of a bigger thing that Scrutiny might want to focus on. So it might be that we put this in for discussion at the next meeting as part of the future work plan. Is that possible? Because and suggestions like that might be good, but it's just sounding like there's a lot of,
well, just somebody who can come in for some Q&As, who has a lot of expertise in terms of teams of people independently monitoring the quality of the water, who will say that there are people on the within Thames 21 who have also been on the board of Thames Water, and there might be some sort of conflict of interest. So it would be really good to look into this.
Brilliant. I think we've got that one. We got that one down, discuss the work plan as well. I'm not seeing any other hands, so I'm going to suggest that we move to the next item. Thank you very much to everyone for coming along and answering our questions and the report as well. Moving backwards, so we're going to move to the Child Poverty Review Group report. I think Hosnia, I can see on the Zoom. So we've had Sutana speaking for 5 minutes, and I'm going to sort of ask that Hosnia maybe stick to roughly the same timeline to introduce this piece of work. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for having me, and apologies for not being able to be there in person. I'm still at work in hospital, unfortunately. So I just want to start by saying we're all very proud of this piece of work, and thank you very much to all the councillors who were on Scrutiny at the time, were part of the Child Poverty Review Group. Lucy, Ajaz, Liz and Dick, and Tom Hudson, who's now left, who did an absolutely brilliant job putting all this together and guiding us through the very complex subject of child poverty. And finally, I just want to say a big thank you to District Action, Oxford District Action on Child Poverty, especially Fran Bennett, who put in a lot of time and effort in really guiding us through this complex topic. And they have, for many, many years, if you're not familiar with them, they have with a very small group of people, including Sue, I think, who was here earlier, have done a huge amount of work in this area. And I want to commend them for that work and thank you for the support that you're giving us in the council. So just giving you a summary of this paper, I want to start by just laying out some of the context. We considered child poverty when we were looking at the removal of the COVID-related supports which are about to come in, such as a furlough scheme and the £20 uplift to universal credit. Things have actually got considerably worse over that time. There's now the cost of living crisis that we are in the midst of. And I just want to say something that I'm going to repeat again at the end, that poverty is the result of political choice. And that means national and local choices. And it's really important that we put this at the heart of everything that we do. And as the economic strategy paper, which I think you're looking at later, points out, Cambridge and Oxford are the most unequal cities in England, with the persistence of child poverty in England as a whole. So 9 children in a classroom of 30 in 2019 were living in poverty. And that's 3.9 million children in England, in the UK, sorry, apologies. And there are a huge number of structural factors in play. And you can see that and how they interact with each other when you're looking at racially minoritized groups, with 46% of children are in poverty. There are also strong connections between poverty and disability. And this all comes out of the structures: in-work poverty, poor quality work that is inflexible and poorly paid and part-time, no night time for rest, etc. The benefits gap, which has actually put a huge number of people in poverty. The rising costs of living that we're seeing, especially currently, but a long-standing issue of housing that's 12 times the average wages in Oxford. And the lowest paid 20% of the UK labour market, there's a huge proportion of those people who are then families in poverty and children in poverty, and the very, very high childcare costs. And over decades, things have changed, but the numbers have pretty much stayed the same. There was in 2010 and some of the changes that were brought in under the Labour government, those numbers did improve, but things have gone backwards quite significantly. And the majority of the children that now are in poverty live in families where at least one parent works. That's 75%. And I just want to really emphasize that point, because we all need to be aware of the kind of rhetoric that talks about families that make bad choices, that, the undeserving poor, etc., because these are families that are at least one parent is working. And in fact, being a lone parent and a lone woman parent's family is actually a very high risk of being in poverty, because of the fact that there is also a gender pay gap. So we are now looking at things like housing costs, the low wage, poor quality jobs, and the rising cost of living has meant that people are having to choose between essentials, food and heating. And this is before you get onto other things, extra things, for example, school trips. So I do know that some schools in the county do make sure that no child is excluded just because of costs of trips, for example. And the negative consequences are huge in health, in education, in long-term earnings, in entrapment in the criminal justice system, which is actually also very racialized. And this is clearly worse for racialized communities, for those with mental ill health. Some of our council strategies are hugely to be commended, many of which were recommended by the Scrutiny Committee's 2015 Combating Inequality report. This is around housing strategy, around the advice centres, the council tax reduction schemes, the discretionary housing payments, all of which were commended by both people who came to give us locally, who came to give us evidence, but also more national figures such as Naomi Eisenstadt, who is a huge figure in this area and who was a civil servant who led on the Sure Start work. And the themes that I just want to draw your attention to Children should be valued and cared for as beings rather than becomings. It's not about what they can contribute in the future, it's about who they are now. And they're suffering, and poverty is causing them a huge amount of unhappiness, which requires intervention in the present. And that, I just want to credit that comment to Baroness Lister, whose writing is hugely important in this area, and I recommend any of you are interested in this area to have a read of her work. The stigma of poverty is one of many compelling reasons why universal
wrapping up so we can
for cash first approaches are really need to be favoured. And we looked at strategic level work, we looked at how we might work with partners and actually convince them to become civic institutions, and then we identified some quick wins. So what do we need to change, Lizzie? I'm getting to the point. We need to change, and we need to hear the voices of those in poverty. This needs to be addressed in a holistic way, puts dignity and human rights of those in poverty front and centre, and really listens to children in poverty, for example. And that can be done through things like a Poverty Truth Commission. We need to make changes to ensure all institutions are acting in a unified manner as civic institutions. And that's why there are some easy wins, like reinstating the living wage champion separate from the leadership, some structural changes which are explicit and lead other institutions. And that's about the socio-economic duty, which I really want to commend to all of you and make sure it would be great to have cabinet support on. All civic institutions signing up to this and us leading on that. It wouldn't actually change our policies a huge amount, but it would make sure that we are leading in this and we are convincing others in the city to become civic and anchor institutions. Having a Poverty Truth Commission that hears from those affected, having cash first, food first, supporting those initiatives, because that they maintain dignity and they empower people and they explicitly address food poverty rather than just food waste. And I know that it's a thriving community strategy, but we do need to explicitly put poverty and child poverty on top of the agenda. And as I said again before, poverty is a result of political choice. That means there's things we can do locally. Obviously, hopefully we'll have a different government in place that will do a lot more nationally. But I really would love to see a huge, as much support as we can from our cabinet members on this, because I think it's a hugely important area of work, and there's a lot we can still do to tackle this real stain on our society. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions now or later on email.
Thank you very much, both for joining from work and also for this brilliant report as well. I think I'm just going to hand over quickly to Alice, because there have been some slight changes that I think she circulated around via email earlier, but just to clarify what those are in case you haven't had a chance to see that.
Yeah, thank you. So we sent the draft report to the contributors for the review, just to get their feedback, and the report was kind of generally very well received for the content. There were a few proposed minor amendments, which were kind of factual corrections, some grammatical things, and a few clarifications of the language used. So that was circulated for information. The main change was actually a proposed amendment to recommendation 1, which was to clarify that any promotion of an Oxford Good Employers Charter would be an expansion of the Oxford living wage rather than instead of, which the recommendation initially kind of said, and contributors felt that was a little bit odd. So the recommendation is that the committee agree the report with the revised recommendation 1, and subject to minor amendments to include grammatical and factual corrections delegated to the scrutiny officer in consultation with the chair of the review group and the chair of the committee.
Brilliant. Are there any sort of questions or comments both on the report or on the amendments as well? Okay, I'm seeing Councillor Arshad and Councillor, oh my gosh, sorry, Jarvis, thank you.
Yeah, no, I just want to echo, my thanks to the whole team and yourself for doing this work. And I agree that this is very important, that needs greater focus on at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Jarvis, and then Councillor Tidball.
Thank you. Yeah, just to echo those comments that this is a hugely impressive piece of work and really important to see, and wholeheartedly support the recommendations. I just had a couple of questions on some of the specific elements of it in relation to the sections around work and income from work. The first being around the living wage, and so firstly, I think it's hugely welcome that there's the recommendation to bring back the living wage champion, and also the note around the work that's being done to utilise procurement, the council's procurement system for using that as leverage to drive up the take-up of the Oxford living wage. I guess my question was really whether the review group considered the possibility of increasing the weighting in award criteria for contracts on the Oxford living wage, increasing the amount that's weighted for. And then my second question in a similar area is there's a brief mention in the report around encouraging trade union membership. And given that we know that unionisation is often the single biggest determinant of increasing in pay and better pay for people, whether there was any consideration given to encouraging not just union membership but also unionisation as part of the kind of approach to tackling the issues around pay and child poverty.
Thank you very much for bringing those 2 points up. I mean, on the trade union, I'll just go backwards. On the trade union front, absolutely, that is it. And actually, in the good employer, that's why we were considering the good employer model as a whole, because that would actually include unionisation of the workplace, because obviously temporary and poor quality jobs that are not unionised are often associated with poverty, and they have quite a strong association with poverty. And we did certainly, that's why we're considering that the Oxford living wage could be expanded to have a good employer charter, because that aspect of it itself is really, really important. And also it's also really important for things like, for example, disabled residents, because there's a huge association between disability and child poverty and poverty itself, because of all the extra incurred costs. And in fact, if people are in poor quality jobs that are not unionised, it's often that disabled residents are disproportionately then at risk of being in poverty and suffering the ill consequences of poverty. So it's certainly something to consider, and that's why the Good Employer Charter is something that we had considered, and we are recommending that it's thought about. I do think on the living wage front and how much of that is, I know that procurement has recently come through scrutiny and gone through a process of looking at what percentage is allocated to each section of it. And we felt that probably overall, what would be a greater benefit is if we focused more on getting more of the employers onto the to actually sign up to the living wage itself, and also to use more of our partnerships in a way that, for example, the socioeconomic duty would, if we had that instituted ourselves, we could lead by example. It wouldn't affect our policies very much because we have a huge wealth of work that is tackling this issue. Obviously, we would like it to be more explicit than it is at the moment, but it is there. And what would have the impact of that would be is, for example, through maybe the Oxford Strategic Partnership, through other avenues, we could then encourage our partners and to actually act as, unfortunately, a lot of institutions in the city don't act as civic institutions. What's common between Oxford and Cambridge is the fact that they are dominated by these ancient universities that actually are real drivers of inequality in the city. And that's why we need to push them to become civic institutions and to really do that work within their domain. I hope that answers the question to some extent, Chris. It's we did actually look at that. It's just that the gain, I think, would be greater if we managed to have a structure that encourages, but in a more structured way, other institutions to do the same.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to ask everyone to sort of keep their contributions as concise as possible. I'm going to go to Councillor Tidball, then Councillor Altaf Khan, and then Councillor Rowley.
Just want to say that this is a really terrific piece of work, and I think this council can hold its head up high in terms of what it did during the pandemic to lead its frontline response to ensure that no one went hungry in this city during that period, and that we did as much as we possibly could within the limitations that we had to serve our community. And I'm really, really delighted to see in this recommendation 11 finally adopting the socio-economic duty in the way that the last Labour government intended it. And for those who were involved in the work that we began when I was cabinet member on our equality strategy, this is something that I argued for in that context, because it's absolutely the best way to raise up all protected characteristics. So really, really pleased to see this and heartily endorse it. And ditto the expansion of the leader of the council's portfolio to include poverty prevention. I think that's a really fantastic way to keep this on the agenda and spotlighted, and also to track the changes, but not least to better understand and lobby government, where we are seeing that policies coming down from national government are affecting residents in our city. So really, really delighted to see that, and thanks to you and all those who have done work on this really, brilliant review group report and set of recommendations.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Marie, and thank you for all the work you've done. And I think also it really is the fact that if we had a very clear structure encouraging other institutions to really do what they should have been doing historically, really, to be anchors in the city, would really be the thing that would make, I think, quite a lot of impact. And yes, thank you for all you did during the pandemic too. And I think one of the aspects I would just also draw your attention to around food poverty is that there were recommendations from actually all of the experts who gave evidence that actually kind of food first and cash first strategies are often less stigmatizing and are better at maintaining dignity. And though there is obviously a room for different approaches, that the food waste strategy aim organizations should be supported, as well as the food first type organizations, because of the stigma involved and because of the fact that many don't feel comfortable actually talking about of their daily living. I mean, one of the comments was around the many reports.
I'm just going to suggest that this. I think we all sound like we're welcoming what is a brilliant report, and unless anyone has anything that they really want to raise as kind of an issue before we move to approve the recommendations set out, then I think I'd suggest we move on. But I can still see some hands, so I'll go to people who want to sort of raise things before we move to that vote to approve the recommendations. But I'm going to suggest we take those as a bunch, and then if there's anything to come back on, I go back to you, if that's okay, Hosnia. So Councillor Altaf Khan.
Yes, I am not going to repeat what is being said, and just welcoming what I looked at. Number of recommendations suggest about the external funding and resources. I'm sure until we don't, this as authority doesn't get properly funded, the work we wanted to do cannot be done. So for that, recommendation number 11, where it says cross-party motion on social economics duty, I'm sure Liberal Democrats will support that if that comes to the full council. And that's the funding issue. I am very much interested. We need to put sort of foot down to get some extra resources so the local authority can help. And the second point, there is not much of mention. There are some individuals who are going through some sort of immigration issues and don't get any funding or any resources from anywhere, and they have sort of families or child linked to them. So obviously, if they can't feed or food themselves, how they would be able to support the children, whether they're living in this city or abroad or somewhere else. So I do a number of individual cases. So just wanted to raise what sort of things we can do for those people who even can't have the bread at the end of their evening.
I think we're not really able to kind of amend the recommendations as they stand, and I think a lot of the recommendations do centre around sort of doing more work around this. So I'm sure that can be brought up. I might be wrong on that, but I think
we did actually. We were hoping to hear from Asylum Welcome around no recourse to public funds. It's certainly an issue that we did discuss and we did think about. But a lot of, and that's why hence the cash first recommendations, because actually that area in itself, when it is without, direct debit details, etc., etc. That is where families who have no recourse to public funds are actually able to still benefit from. And I know that in our housing policy and our advice centre policy, we certainly do make sure that those with no recourse to public funds are not penalised, but they're also that there is no reporting between those advice centres and the housing services and the immigration and the Home Office, and that's been long standing with our work as a city of sanctuary. But it was certainly something that we did consider, and that's why the evidence from many people like Naomi Eisenstadt also talked about kind of cash first and food first approaches. I hope that answers your question, Councillor.
Brilliant, thank you. Councillor Rowley.
Thank you, Chair. Briefly, I'm talking about, and thank you, Chris, for bringing up the living wage and unionisation section of the report. And I'd add to that it costs nothing to bring the living wage campaign and our local unions into the conversation as much as possible, to take every opportunity to do that. And I'm sure the cabinet members in the room are as committed to that as I am, particularly in the light of the knowledge they have of communities that are more likely to be in low-paid work, casual 0 hours, etc. And one brief point on recommendation 36, which I obviously agree with, about prepayment meters. We also have to bear in mind that a lot of people have no choice but to use prepayment meters because those meters belong to their private landlords, and that feeds into the housing, the impact of housing on poverty, which is a whole other conversation. But I thought I should mention it.
Thank you, Mike. And yes, the private rented sector work.
I think I'm just going to jump to Councillor Belly Summers, and then if you could take both of their points in one.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Osni, for a marvellous, amazing report. We just wanted to talk about the use of food bank. So you know that the use of food bank obviously has increased, especially in OX4, but there has been some problem from food banks, some organizations like Oxford Mutual Aid, regarding the business model from Sophia, which doesn't seem very sustainable and ethical. So they're applying inflation prices to their food surplus, creating problem for grassroots organizations as well as food banks, at a time where the demand and food parcels are very much increased, doubled and tripled in the last year. I don't know if you wanted to say something about that, or if the council had something to say about that. Thank you very much. And yes, anyway.
Thank you very much. And yes, and Mike, on that comment, the private rented sector, that's why even more so the work in the private rented sector that the council is undertaking now is really, really crucial, because there's a lot around poverty and the private sector that needs tackling. So thank you for mentioning that. And Nadine, yes, I think that's why we did get quite a lot of verbal reports from multiple organisations, including Sophia, including Oxford Mutual Aid. And I think there are certain issues, and there's some more details in the report. I do think that the Sophia model works for some people, but it certainly does not work for everyone, and that's why there's a need for support of the other organisations that do a different type of food poverty approach. I do think, yes, there is certainly there have been some issues raised around some of the, for example, the mix of foods that people are being given within Sophia, and of course for people with no recourse to public funds, the direct debit nature of it, and also the fact that it's like a 2-hour window. And in fact, if you look at during the pandemic, the people who were in poverty struggled even more with food because they couldn't go to places to pick up food, or they couldn't go down to different shops to get cheaper food, for example. So yeah, that is an issue, and that's why we're recommending that the council looks at, when it's doing I know that the good food strategy is being done as an overview, and that's why it would be great to see those recommendations brought into that. And also I just want to mention here the thriving community strategy. It would be fantastic to see this work explicitly focus on poverty and child poverty within the thriving community strategy that I know is being developed currently. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks again. So I think what we're recommended to do is that we approve the report with the revised recommendation one, which Alice mentioned previously. And then I think the other amendments were typos, grammatical errors, and that we delegate that to the scrutiny officer to finalise. Is this something that's going to change how you vote to approve the report or not?
I can just mention something
Very quickly, because we do have a very packed agenda.
On both discretionary housing payments and council tax reduction, because it's not covered in your excellent report, it would be good to know if we've assessed the eligibility versus the uptake. So
I think we've got the council tax reduction scheme is something that comes to scrutiny report every year, so that will be discussed by scrutiny report. I think that this is a fairly, I guess, specific review group. So I think if you don't mind, if we sort of focus that when it comes up in scrutiny's agenda.
Sure. Okay.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. So is everyone clear on what we're voting on? Yeah. Okay. Not seeing any hands. So all those in favour? Brilliant. And thank you very much again, Hosnia, for joining tonight. So next we've got the Oxford Economic Strategy, and I think we've got a speaker from the public who's joining us for this item. So I'm going to invite Evelyn Sanderson to speak. We've got 5 minutes. Oh, yes, sorry. If you go to that chair over there with the microphone and then turn the microphone on so you can see the red band. Thank you.
Thank you. Oxford Economic Strategy is of enormous importance, not only in addressing Oxford's current problems, which touched on a few of them already: inequality, unaffordability and child poverty, overstretched infrastructure, air and water pollution, to name a few, but also in ensuring that Oxford is well prepared for a future in which the climate emergency, ecological breakdown and global insecurity are very real and increasingly serious challenges. Now we have the additional stresses of the cost of living crisis and fuel poverty, and the threat of food rationing, which would focus priorities even more acutely on meeting the needs of all of Oxford's residents. The Council's report on the economic strategy suggests that there is endorsement. However, 80% of respondents to the online consultation felt that the OES had not fully captured the right issues and challenges. There were an unprecedented number of responses raising serious and fundamental concerns about the aims, yet the report either dismisses them or makes only minor changes to the wording. The key criticism made is that the global aim is incompatible with the inclusive and zero carbon elements. The needs of Oxford residents and those of our local and the global environment that sustain us are at odds with the predominant growth agenda. The revised OES now refers to this challenge, but makes no major changes in approach, nor does it give any evidence as to how this fundamental incompatibility of aims will be overcome. For example, inclusivity is at odds with the growth plan for 25,000 new tech jobs in the city. This follows a more than 1,000% increase in Oxford life science jobs in the 5-year period from 2013 to 2018. Oxford does not need jobs. It has 99% employment. These new jobs will attract a highly skilled workforce with housing demands that will push up house prices even further and worsen inequality. Cambridge has already pursued this route and is even more unequal than Oxford. And it's interesting to hear Hosnia refer to the universities as partly drivers of this level of inequality. Growth plans increase our carbon footprint through construction, operation, consumption, and transport. There is no techno fix on the horizon that will allow us to meet the zero carbon by 2040 challenge of these plans. The headline finding of Oxford Citizens' Assembly on climate change was that enhanced biodiversity was central to the overall net zero vision for Oxford. The scale of development and change planned will result in concreting over Oxford's green spaces, floodplains and green belt, and will build over rather than build on the commitment to this key recommendation. The current strategy has serious omissions, both in content and in community involvement. There is no mention of local food production or food security, and the report highlights the serious lack of engagement with Oxford's 160,000 residents. Only a single respondent to the consultation identified as a member of the BAME community. Given the importance of the OES as a key strategic document, 1 week seems insufficient time for councillors to digest and report the report and recommendations. Today's packed agenda also does not allow enough time for the serious consideration that it requires. The current timeframe pushes for the rapid acceptance and implementation of the revised but largely unchanged OES. The report suggests that there is a willingness to use the consultation feedback and wider community engagement to guide the scope of the economic strategy and its delivery plan as it is developed. So why not include the key stakeholder input in the strategy document itself to ensure more compatible aims from the outset? We suggest that the adoption of the OES should be deferred for 3 reasons. 1, to include crucial changes to the aims and strategy from the current feedback. 2, to engage meaningfully with Oxford's diverse communities. And finally, to give sufficient time to ensure that the aims are coherent, deliverable, and fit for the future. Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to come and address us this evening. I'm now going to hand over to Councillor Brown to introduce the report.
Thank you. And if I may, I'd also obviously like to address some of the comments that have just been made. So perhaps you could allow me a little time to do that as well. I mean, personally, I think it's actually really helpful having this come immediately after the report that you've just heard from Hosnia, and it sounds like a really excellent piece of work. And there are a couple of points that she made in my hearing, which I think are actually well addressed by both our economic strategy, the document that is in front of you, but also our wider work on an inclusive economy. So, for instance, Hosnia referred to setting up an inclusive employer charter, and that's something that very explicitly we are already working on through the inclusive economy group that we set up across the county to try and make sure that we're not just talking about the Oxford living wage, but indeed, quite rightly, as Hosnia's identified, working across a much wider and range of different issues that truly inclusive employers would be looking at, which includes working with people who are, far from the workplace, looking at qualifications, disability, people who might have had difficult employment records, been in prison, all of those sorts of things. That's precisely the sort of work that we are already doing. Interestingly, while I've been carrying the can for the Oxford Living Wage Champion, we have signed up both of the 2 universities as Oxford Living Wage employers, which I'm personally really proud of. There's still an awful long way to go, particularly with Oxford colleges, and I never cease to take the opportunity to raise that with them. But to get onto the strategy, before I get onto the strategy, I am just going to respond to the comments that were made. I'm afraid I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what the economic strategy is for, what it does and what it sets out to do. This isn't about setting out growth in jobs and housing. It is addressing the existing planned growth in jobs and housing that we already know about, because it's set out in a local plan and it's set out in various documents that are already in existence. And so this is what's happening already. But what we've set out in our economic strategy is how to handle that to make sure that it is as inclusive as possible. And the whole strategy is about making this inclusive. It's about balancing out all the different things that you absolutely rightly raised that we have to balance out. Looking at how do we get the balance right between making sure that we are providing affordable housing that we have identified as desperately needed in Oxford against the needs to address the climate crisis? These are really difficult issues, and we have sought across a range of different documents and strategies to look at them, and this is just one of those different strategies, and focuses on a particular aspect, which is our economy. So to get on to sort of introducing the paper per se, I mean, first of all, I'd like to say we actually started work on this before the pandemic. That's how long ago it all started. And we started the work on this from with nothing. We started from the bottom up. We started talking to councillors, to stakeholders about what it was we were trying to achieve, what we wanted to do with our economic strategy. And that, to me, is really important because that is how you find out and work together to actually develop a strategy that meets the aims and values of our organisation, and that is what I think we have in front of us. It was extensively consulted and engaged on, and I think I heard from your speaker both that it was extensively responded to and not responded to enough. I mean, I think there was a good response to it from both local residents and from local stakeholders, including businesses, and you'd expect there to be a considerable input to an economic strategy from local business, and it's important that there is. So I welcome that, and I'd like to take the opportunity to thank absolutely everybody who did give us their views during the course of the process, because that's really important, and it has shaped quite a substantial number of changes in the document. It seems to me that we're producing this strategy at a particularly key time. So we are in a period of, at best, economic recovery post the pandemic, and at worst facing a recession. Which has potentially got a big impact on both our city and our national economy, and indeed the global economy. And we've obviously also got a huge cost of living crisis. So all of those things are exacerbating the existing inequalities that we're well aware of in Oxford. And that means that it's even more important for us to have jobs that pay well, that are good jobs, and that are providing good quality employment for local people, and that we're also providing good quality and affordable housing for local people. And that is what we're trying to set out in this particular report. It is also worth flagging that in spite of my doom and gloom about the economy, Oxford's own economy is still seen to be growing very fast. And this is not, this is happening. There are many reports which provide evidence that that is the case. And just very recently, Oxford was identified as one of the fastest growing cities in the UK. And we can see it very visibly. We can see that the price of office space in Oxford is absolutely going through the roof. So we need to make sure we are planning properly for the growth that is already happening, and that we make sure that we work with employers to make sure they are providing inclusive jobs and are providing for local people as part of that growth. And that is what this strategy sets out to do. I think, to be honest, I'm going to pause there because I could go on all night. And in fact, I think it's probably better if I hand over to you to ask questions or give comments. But actually, Matt, you may want to say plenty before I do that.
Thanks, Susan. I won't say too much because it's important that we get the questions in, but I will just reflect on some of the key points in the report. So essentially, when you do look at the consultation responses, we have done our very best to listen to those responses and make changes. As you rightly said, the inclusion theme, the zero carbon theme, they had 80% agreement across the board. The global theme was one that was less well supported and less well understood. There was certainly disagreement about that. It was construed perhaps as seeking growth as a goal overall, but actually what we are trying to do, as Susan explained, is trying to manage and sustain that growth in a way which is sustainable and inclusive. But we learned a lot more from that as well. So we obviously then looked at the global theme and tried to make that much clearer. And Oxford is an economy which is linked to the universities, the medical sciences we have here, and is a globally impactful and purposeful economy. That's something that we just have in Oxford. It's a strength that we had that is a benefit to the world. And it isn't about perhaps globalization, which it was construed. It's actually about ensuring that global impact is positive. And we have that global impact in net zero as well. We have the opportunity to look at projects like Energy Superhub Oxford and many others that we're doing as a council with partners to actually, the Energy Systems Accelerator, to amplify those and make sure there are benefits globally from that. And that isn't about greed, it isn't about growth, it's about ensuring that our economy has a positive impact. So we hope that we've reflected that messaging in the right way to allow that to happen. Notably as well, when we've looked at some of the other key revisions, I just want to flag the revisions that we felt were important and hopefully reflect all of the comments we've had as well as possible. So one, we've revised the report to make a much clearer commitment and make the commitment that is there much clearer on sustainable development. And we've tried to do that by emphasizing the climate assembly targets and by through the case studies that we've added to the report, showing the significant number of projects that are already seeking to move us towards net zero. We can't get away from the fact there are contradictions occasionally. There are obviously contradictions between a growing economy and net zero, but there are projects that we are doing to try and address that. Projects like Oxford Living Wage, projects like Owned by Oxford, which are around community wealth building, projects like the Oxfordshire Inclusive Economy Partnership, which Susan has mentioned, and it links to the poverty report we've heard tonight. Projects like Meanwhile in Oxfordshire that are about reusing existing retail space, and projects like OFAS, which we've worked very hard to deliver as well, to handle things like flooding, but also support biodiversity, and that's all linked to the economic development actions we have. So hopefully that is a sense of where there's real action to deliver on all three of these themes. Other changes, as I said, there was a sense from some that we weren't really taking inequality seriously. We've tried to address that through the revised report. There was perhaps a sense that we didn't have enough examples of where we're working with the LEP, where we're working with Department for Work and Pensions on skills and employment. So projects like Kickstart, 16 to 24 work placements, projects like the social contract scheme that LEP are bringing forward to support local skills are also important as well. Community employment plans at places like Oxford North, which is obviously a major development, but looking at community employment benefits from those to ensure they do occur locally and in other developments as well. Workspaces, making sure there's affordable workspace, making sure there's training places in those workspaces. So trying to bring together environmental issues in those workspaces as well as inequality issues, as well as providing affordable workspace. I'll be brief because I know we need to do questions. Housing wasn't mentioned in a very significant way, and that was raised by a number of people. That's now a guiding principle under the inequality theme around affordable and available housing. It was mentioned in the report, but because it was delivered by other strategies, we hadn't sort of emphasized it, but we've now given it that emphasis. In terms of other changes, there was still it was felt that we need to continue to try and work to support businesses that are recovering from the pandemic and that will now be affected by, of course, the quality of life, the issues around cost of living, which are going to obviously affect our local businesses even more. So I need to continue to try and support businesses working with the local enterprise partnership. Yes, a huge demand for lab and workspace, where we can use existing buildings for that and existing brownfield sites is great. But other than that, it's existing allocated sites, and we recognise that there is a balance to be struck with housing as well. And the other key comments which we've responded to as well, the delivery plan that we put forward was huge. It was ambitious, but it was a list, and there's a need to prioritise that. So we've gone so far to prioritise that sort of prioritisation of 1, 2, and 3. But we'll continue to work with the Economic Growth Board to do that further. The comment that the Economic Growth Board was not diverse enough is something that we're responding to. We've developed a long list of stakeholders to invite to be part of that board. So we're looking to expand that Economic Growth Board in terms of its diversity in a general sense, in a population sense, but also in terms of the perspectives around economic development, around inclusion, around net zero. So we're working on that as well as we get this put forward. I think some of the design, the maps, that kind of thing in the strategy did perhaps create the impression that we were developing large parts of the green belt, but in fact that's not the case. So we've changed that and tightening the maps to make sure that isn't the case as well. So we've made a lot of changes, and we have tried to listen, and we recognise that this is an ongoing process as well to build a consensus around economic development. It's a very important time as we try and transition to net zero and see inequality getting worse. The reason we're doing a new economic strategy is because we recognise that the last one didn't have any of that in it at all. So I think that was the key point for us, renewing this and seeing the need for it. I'll stop there, but I think the other thing that we've said is that we just need to try and engage on future projects, on new projects with those groups that didn't respond to the consultation. And as you rightly say, BAME groups and also younger groups as well, there was a very limited response to the consultation there. So that's something we need to try to do in future.
Thanks very much. I think Councillor Tidball needs to head off, so I'm just going to, well, mainly me scooting. Thank you again, Evelyn, for coming along. You can take a seat at the back of the room now because this bit of the discussion's for the committee. Brilliant. So I'm going to take questions first. I saw Councillor Riley first and then Councillor Altaf Khan. So if we could actually take them in groups of 3. So then I'll take Councillor Mundy, if that's okay with both of you. Yeah, fantastic. So yeah, Councillor Riley, go ahead. No worries. In which case, Councillor Altaf Khan.
My first point is towards the consultation and the diverse community and the VMA community. You said that we will include in the future plans and the future activities, but I think it's an important document if we don't have enough responses. So we do need to know why we don't get those communities on board and how do we get them. It's no point saying next one and the same thing will happen. So there maybe need a special way of getting into and letting them coming on board and trying to have their say at the time. So again, if we miss it this time, we can miss it again. We need to, I think, change the way we trying to talk. So that's my first point. And second, we talked about a lot about the housing and building, which is living cost, a number of things, but coming to the point, I would like to see very clear, not sort of taking any green belt or green spaces and the floodplains. So there is a lot of concerns from the constituents we represent that building on the green belt and floodplains. So that is something very carefully as a city when we have done, I think, this site allocation plan, looking at the places where and what sort of houses can go. So that's the 2 things I wanted to be addressed.
Thanks. I'll go to Councillor Mundy, but can I just say, I think there are some things maybe that are being raised as well that don't fully fall under the scope of this report. I think quite a few of those points are actually to do with local plan, and in the interest of keeping this discussion sort of as focused as possible. But I think as is made. Okay. And Councillor Mundy.
Thank you. So I just wanted to say one thing, because Susan Brown pointed out about the universities being Oxford Living Wage employers. I just wanted to point out that there's a lot of employees who work obviously directly for colleges, most of which don't pay the Oxford Living Wage. So we do actually have a lot of work to do there in terms of promoting the Oxford Living Wage. I'd also wanted to discuss really about really engaging the wider community, including working class people, migrant communities, and those precariously employed in this kind of economic strategy, because I'm not really convinced that this is really going to be the sort of trickle-down effect that we're looking for, or you're looking for more in that report. And I don't really see that there's sufficient evidence in the report that we're going to be breaking the inequality in the city that we need to see. You've specified about affordable housing. I think that we should be more specifically talking about council housing. We've got the highest rate of private renters in the UK in this city, and really we actually need to be focusing most predominantly on council housing. And when it comes to zero carbon Oxford, I think we do need to be careful about accepting an inconsistency really in terms of our zero carbon strategy. We have to look at the pressure on infrastructure as it is at the moment, and what this kind of economic strategy is going to be doing for the future when we look at how things are at the moment. Going back to being open to our working class communities, we're talking a lot about tech and science jobs, and I just think that we need to be more open about the way we're looking at this. So, thank you.
I'll just hand back to Councillor Brown and Matt to see if, what you want to come back on. If you're happy to, got a long list, but okay, could I just see hands quickly again? I think I saw Councillor Rowley's hand first, so I'll go to you first.
Thank you, and sorry, Chair, we seem to be into comments rather than questions, so I'll go ahead if I may. One of the points raised in the public consultation, and we talk in paragraph 12 about making explicit the challenges. One of the points raised, I believe, was that we should be more explicit about the challenges posed by national policy, particularly where it could help and does hinder. And I think that's especially important when it comes to the intersection between carbon reduction, housing our people, and economic growth. So let's be clear, the economic growth and economic development and urban development is going to happen. The question is to what extent local communities have input and control over that, and that is one of the primary goals of this economic strategy. It's done in a context of a system where, when it comes to planning and other decisions that impact local economies, local quality of life and local environment, that is centralized to an extent that greatly surprises our colleagues in most other OECD countries. So I do think that we need to take every opportunity to be explicit about that, and not confine our comments about what we would like to see to the kind of Oxford we would like to see, to the kind of Oxford that this council can achieve with its powers alone. I know that we don't do that, but I do take the challenge from the member of the public who I believe circulated comments around us all, that we could be doing more of that, and particularly when it comes to addressing and trying to incorporate some of the other concerns that have been raised by members of the public about the impact of economic growth on Oxford and on the council's climate change ambitions in particular.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll try and take them in the order in which they were raised, so to avoid confusion as far as possible. So Altaf, on consultation, I think there's a generalised point which I think around consultation, which is that it's difficult to get it right. It's difficult to, particularly I think, to engage with people on strategies, because not very many people want to sit down, read a strategy and give you their comments on it. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's quite important to have different ways of engaging with people and offer people different opportunities to get involved at different stages. And we did do a number of workshops for stakeholders and for residents And I think you're quite right to, and you know, we accept the challenge that the response was not as inclusive as we would have liked it to have been. And that is something that we will continuously look at. It's one of the reasons why we have a citizens panel, is to try and make sure that we do have an inclusive way of a way of testing our consultation processes against a group of people who are, by definition, an inclusive group of people, and I do think that that is really important. So, you know, that's a point well made. On the point that you were making around housing and green spaces, Chair's quite right. You know, this document does not set out a single new housing area. It is reflecting the existing policies and plans that are in place. So and there will always be tensions. And you know, I was very explicit about that when I set out my opening remarks. There are tensions in our city between the need to provide housing and people's unwillingness to ever see a piece of land which currently has a bit of grass on it developed for housing. You know, those are explicit problems that we have to address, but we cannot ignore them. And, you know, we need to make sure that we are also providing housing for people. Edward specifically mentioned colleges. So did I, Edward. I specifically said when I said about the two universities that there was an awful lot more work still to be done with the colleges. And I do completely agree with that. And I can assure you, I never let the opportunity pass if I'm meeting with any senior people in colleges to remind them that they should be paying the Oxford Living Wage. Sometimes I get a better hearing than others, let's just put it that way. I think you also referred to the trickle-down effect, and I want to very explicitly take you to task on that one, because this absolutely isn't a strategy that seeks to expound on that particularly failed economic theory. It absolutely isn't about that. This is about specific interventions to try and make sure that we are actively engaging with employers and with people in our city to make sure that people who are currently excluded from our economy are included. And it builds on work, frankly, that we've been doing as a local council for quite a long time. So, for instance, when the Westgate was built, we ensured that part of the process was to make sure that there were apprenticeship jobs in the construction process. And, you know, all the way through that particular process, we made sure that there were inclusive employment practices in place. And I think that's really important. You picked up the issue around affordable housing and council housing, and I may have to refer in terms of the detail to Matt on that, but you're right, I think, to pick up on it, because I think lots of people assume if we say affordable housing that we mean the government's useless definition of affordable housing, which is not our definition of affordable housing, which is nearly always council housing. Although I think I would want to say that in the context of this document, it probably should also be including genuinely affordable, i.e. not the government's definition, housing to buy, which is likely to be shared ownership for this city, but also potentially some key worker housing as well.
Can I just jump in there and suggest we note that down as unless you're going to say that it's already included, we note that down as a recommendation?
I'm happy for you to do that. Yes.
Just so, looking to, fantastic.
Yeah. Then I think that the next point was Mike's around the national policy challenges, and I think it is a really good one, Mike. I think it's a really important point to pick up from the consultation, and I hope it is one that we do take on board. I mean, I was actually thinking earlier today that one of the things that we need to do more of is continuing to make the case alongside other local councils, alongside local government more generally, for things which I think would make a significant difference to our city, powers that we don't currently have. You know, one of them, very obviously, it's something we've talked about frequently in Scrutiny, is a tourism tax. That is something that would not impact at all in terms of the pockets of taxpayers in this city, but it would bring in income to spend on the costs of providing for tourists in our city. And it's something that across the world is incredibly common. People are very used to paying it, but we are explicitly not allowed to raise a tourism tax in Oxford. We don't have the powers to do it. We've consistently asked government for them, and they've consistently said no. So we continue to campaign on that, and that's just one very small example of one of the things that could make a material difference to our city, give us more money to invest in the kinds of things that we want to be investing in, and that we're not able to. So that's a point well made.
Matt, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, thank you. Just a couple of points. I mean, on the affordable housing point, that's taken. I mean, we were following the definition in the Oxford Local Plan and our housing strategy. We could perhaps be clearer on that as a recommendation, that is the definition we're following. And the only other thing I would say is, yes, there are a number of tech and science jobs being created, and we recognise that is because of the huge demand from the businesses growing out of the university, the research we have. But we also recognise that doesn't necessarily create jobs that all members of the community can take. That's absolutely a challenge that we recognise. And there are a couple of things you can do to affect that in a positive way. One, work with the tech sector, who will be part of those community employment plans at some of the knowledge sites that are coming forward for end use jobs. Some people will have the talent to go and work in those tech sectors. Some people will have the talent to work in those businesses as they grow. A number of roles will be created, and the idea is to work quite closely to ensure that as developers bring those sites forward, as employers come into those sites, that we try and encourage them very much to be part of tapping into their local workforce and aligning that with our colleges and with our universities offer as well. So that's a key part of this. We recognise there, again, is a contradiction there, but it can at least be managed in some way. And then, of course, there are sectors such as social enterprise. There are sectors such as the visitor economy, the retail sector. We're talking about the city centre action plan next, that create a wider range of jobs. So just to be clear, it isn't all about tech sector jobs. Absolutely not.
And I think just to thank you both for that, to reflect on sort of how the discussion shifted, were there any sort of recommendations in any of those that anyone wanted to raise that were missed? So I'm looking at, I'm actually, sorry, to be clear, looking at Councillor Mundy, because I think we covered Councillor Rowley's and Councillor South Khan. Were there any, no, I'm saying in the questions you raised, were there any recommendations that you wanted off the back of that? I'm asking Councillor, yeah, sorry. I'm asking Councillor Al-Tafkan and Councillor Mundy if there are any recommendations you wanted off the back of the questions you, or points you just raised. Okay. Okay, fantastic. Could we note that one down, just about what was that sort of exactly that you wanted to?
So include the diverse communities and trying to do sort of a different type of consultation if you can't get the responses in normal way.
Brilliant. And Councillor Mundy?
You've taken the recommendation already. I mean, there's also about zero carbon. You didn't quite address the inconsistency about zero carbon Oxford, so I would like that as well.
I'll be honest, Edward, sorry. God, apologies. I didn't fully understand your point on that one.
Just in terms of the impact of this kind of strategy in terms of our footprint, zero carbon wise, and the impact on infrastructure as well was something I pointed out. If we're looking at more people commuting into these kind of areas for working, I'm just saying that, you know, we'd need to have a look at what the impact of that would be.
So can I address that in that case? Because I didn't address it because I hadn't fully followed what you're saying. So again, I think I'd go back to my original points. This isn't talking about creating jobs and creating, it is reflecting the fact that these jobs are being created. in the city. And actually, jobs in the city is probably the most sustainable place to have jobs in the county, because we have got the transport hubs. We've got Oxford Station, we've got Oxford North, we hope to have Cowley Branch Line, we've got better bus services than anywhere else in the county. And we also tend to have denser populations, residential populations. So actually, this is a sustainable way of job creation. But to be clear, this document isn't the one that's creating those jobs. It is reflecting the fact that those jobs are being created, and then it is seeking to try and make sure that that when they arrive, they're as inclusive as possible. I would certainly argue that the city is a sustainable location for jobs, but actually that's not really what this document's about.
Thank you. So again, I'll take sort of points in groups of 3, and also just to help me out, could you kind of flag if what you're saying is shaping up to be a recommendation? I'll try and prompt people as well, but if you could flag it, it's just easy for us to both catch up. So I might take, I'm not sure which order people took their hand, so I'm going to go this way around this time. So I'll take Councillor Jarvis, Councillor Pegg, and then Councillor Arshad.
Yeah, thank you. I guess, yeah, I share a lot of the comments that have been made both by the councillors and by the public speaker about some of the contradictions in the document, particularly the climate stuff and the global strand within it. But putting that aside, I've got kind of 3 really specific points that I wanted to raise. The first is I was glad to see there being a mention of cooperatives as something that was something that we wished to encourage as part of a strategy. I guess my question really is that the economic strategy document itself is quite vague in terms of what that means in practice as to what encouraging and supporting cooperatives looks like, and so some clarity on what that the vision behind that is, and like practically what the council is able to do in terms of encouraging more than beyond saying, you know, we want cooperatives to exist and they're a good form of employment, but like what are the practical levers the council has to drive the cooperative sector. The other 2 points I wanted to raise are more around emissions that I think are in the strategy document itself. And I'm glad to see that off the back of the consultation, there was a move towards diversifying the steering board. But I think it's, at least in the documentation, it's not clear what that means in terms of who those stakeholders are. And I was actually quite struck that in the kind of 90-page document on the economic strategy, there isn't a single mention of trade unions anywhere in a document on economic strategy. And I think that's I find that very odd, given that the people who genuinely create wealth are workers, and their representatives aren't mentioned at any point in the document. So specifically, one small way that could rectify this, and this I think is a recommendation that I'd like to raise, is for there to be explicitly trade union representation on the steering board as one of those groups that's involved in diversifying its membership. And the final point I just wanted to raise as another omission is there are some mentions of biodiversity in the strategy, but very, very little. For me, clearly economic development has an impact, both either positive or negative, on biodiversity. And I think for me, there's a missing metric on in the success factors at the end around both protecting and enhancing and strengthening biodiversity as part of the strategy. Admittedly, then they won't be in even columns, but I think given the importance of biodiversity, it could benefit from being in there.
Yeah, I have 2 things to talk about, both of which I think probably lead to a recommendation. The first being that I think this report talks about so many different businesses that are significant in Oxford, the university, Mini. It does not talk about the third sector very much at all. Is there a single mention of like Oxfam, another massive organisation in this city, or any of the many other NGOs, non-profits and other third sector organisations? So I think it would be really great if there could be a bigger focus on what they contribute to society beyond more traditional kinds of businesses. Though I do appreciate kind of the inclusion of social enterprises and cooperatives. And the second recommendation would be if there could be a clearer way of demonstrating how the competing priorities have been assessed. So the report says lots of great stuff and lots of nice words about how growth is only going to be pursued if it isn't going to breach environmental or social boundaries. But I found that, and I think if I'm finding this, and I'm sure members of the public would also be finding, it's quite unclear about how exactly are you going to balance that and how you're going to demonstrate how you've balanced it. And so I think it'd be good if there was some way that this could kind of create a framework that decisions set out the things that have been balanced against each other. An obvious way of doing that is an Oxford donut, which is something that's been done in lots of places following donut economic principles, but there could be other ways of doing it, something that communicates how you've made that balancing act.
Shall I go? Okay. Yeah, I'll start off with a fun one. Is it right where it says there's a gondola from Redbridge to the city centre? I saw somewhere in your report here, Oxford Economics. It does feel like a bit overall, doesn't it? It's on some areas. I don't know. I've lost. Oh, there it is. Yeah. Page 205, 21, section May 2022. Under heading additional inclusive city projects or initiatives you would like to see. Gondola lift from Redbridge to Oxpens and Westgate. Okay, so is that real?
It's something that's been proposed.
Okay.
No, it's not real.
No. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I just want to, I think members have already suggested about improving the consultation process for people who are from ethnic minorities. And that's really bad. There is zero, is not one from any of them.
Brilliant, we've got that as a recommendation already.
So yeah, moving on is affordability of buses. Is there any way you can reduce the bus fares? And you know, I remember being part of the Oxford Living Wage group initially when it was started out, and I think you're right that we have come you know, quite far in the development of that. But is that something that we can build on with furthermore as a follow-up with universities? And it'd be good to get the statistics of what the contribution is from all the universities, and it just on Oxford Living Wage, because I think that we should actually be targeting the bigger employers who would be able to, you know, because as you can see in the city centre, a lot of businesses are finding it tough to continue and up and down the Carley Road as well. So yeah, that would be something I would recommend highly to focus on out of the whole report. Yeah, that's it really.
To respond. Okay, so back to Chris's points. Just I would say that we're not talking contradictions, we're talking tensions. But I mean, I do say that deliberately because, you know, there are, I mean, I think the sort of modelling that, again, Lucy was referring to is about exploring those tensions and how you have to balance them out. And that, I think, is what we tried to do in the report. I just specifically on cooperatives, I'll ask Matt to respond on the detail, but I think it's a point well made. It is actually something that we've done quite a bit of work on as a city and have actually managed to get some external investment into doing more on. It's tricky. I mean, actually, we had hopes of. Well, actually, I don't think it's a huge secret. Blackwell's were talking at one point of setting their business up as a cooperative, and in the end, very sadly, chose not to do that. And I do think that's a great shame because that's a great Oxford business, which would have been fantastic legacy as a cooperative, and for whatever reason they couldn't in the end make it work. So that is a great shame, but we will continue to support and encourage people to work on cooperatives wherever we can. You
you point out that we haven't got much mention of trade unionism in the document, and that I do think is an omission. So I think we will look at that. So thank you for picking that up. And I mean, I would also say that although the sort of lack of diversity on the steering board was raised as part of the consultation, it was also raised by me prior to the consultation and was already something that we were looking at doing. And that is about a diversification of different businesses, but also literally in diversifying the people around the table a bit more in terms of making sure that it's a little bit more balanced away from white men into a slightly more balanced, hopefully a better reflection of the businesses in Oxford. And I think that's important. I mean, I'd just like to say, though, the people who have been involved in the Economic Steering Board have given a huge amount of time and effort and are absolutely committed to having an inclusive economy in Oxford, and I'd like to thank all of them who've given up their time to do that for some time now. So it's no reflection on them, but I do think we do need to make sure that it is more inclusive. And if and I'll take away and think about the suggestion about a trade union representation on that board. I certainly think it's an interesting one. Biodiversity, in terms of this report, I think is an interesting one too. I mean, I think I would agree with you that I think it is a success indicator for the city. Is it a success indicator for the economic strategy? I guess it possibly is. I just think that there are so many things we could put into this document of the economic strategy, and some of them just don't sit in it. They sit elsewhere. You know, we have various other strategies that cover other elements of this council's business, whether it's the local plan, whether it's the Thriving Community strategy, whether it's the work that we're doing on zero carbon Oxford. Some of these things don't sit here, they sit in other places. It doesn't mean they're not important. It doesn't mean that we're not focused on them. I'm just not 100% sure. I need to think about it, whether it sits in this document. Third sector, Oxfam and NGOs, I just think that's a really good point, and we probably do need to make sure that's included. I already answered your point on the gondola and the cable car. That was a consultation response, and I know that there are a lot of people who are very interested in that. Personally, I don't think it's a very serious response. I mean, I don't think it's a very realistic response at any rate. And in terms of inclusivity of transport, I mean, it's a very big frustration, I think, for many of us sitting around this table that we can't do more to make public transport more affordable. But, you know, and you know, ideally that is something that we would do. But I don't think that this document is going to deliver us an entirely affordable transport system. Would that it did. However, it is one of the things that in a sense, this document is seeking to address, because we are talking to employers about subsidising buses in the city. We are talking to employers about making sure that they are doing everything they can to encourage people to arrive at their workplaces in a sustainable manner. That's why I was saying earlier, I think the city is a sustainable place to have jobs, because we have the buses, we have the trains, we have to some extent the cycle routes and cycle parking, better than a lot of the rest of the county at any rate. And so, you know, this is about trying to use everything that we can to get those systems more affordable and better and more sustainable. But it doesn't come with a sort of a money bag which says, and here's the subsidy for all buses for everyone in the city as yet.
I'll just briefly take the points, the additional ones around cooperatives. So I think if you look at the case studies at the back of the report, there's a mention there of Owned by Oxford. We've been working through a funded programme by Friends Provident with Community Action Group Oxfordshire, Make Space, Solidarity Economy Oxfordshire, and also Aspire to experiment with an approach which is about community economic development, developing cooperatives, working alongside the public sector. So we're working on procurement policies. We're looking at where the capacity could be built within our cooperative sector to link that with our procurement policies. The capacity is often not there at the moment. There are a few examples, of course, but we're working to do that. And what we've done through that program is seed funded, I think, 5 new cooperatives that are looking at schemes in Oxford. We've also used the ARG funding, the additional restrictions funding, which was left from the pandemic. There was a remaining amount, which we took a long time to check whether it was in line with the rules, but it allowed us to essentially fund a number of business support programs as well. So we funded Cooperative Futures, who are based in Gloucestershire, to set up a base in Oxfordshire and start supporting cooperatives here. So we're trying to seed that sector as much as we can and join that up with the top-down community wealth building approach we're talking about, which is obviously using our procurement policies to engage with co-ops, but those co-ops have to be ready. So we're trying to work from both ends of that supply and demand to make that happen. We've also got a challenge, I think, to get across to all departments that have an influence in this, what the influence of community wealth building is, that it doesn't always come at a cost and can have benefits for the local authority as well. So that's going to be an ongoing challenge, but one we're working on. I think the point around sectors was a good one. We didn't mention the likes of Oxfam up front, which is important, but we did mention on page 35 that it's a very important sector. Oxfordshire is a social enterprise place. And so we've flagged that as a key sector. And the other thing I would flag is that we're making efforts through working with B Corps to work with all businesses that have social aims and want to be socially purposeful, whether they're a community interest company, a social enterprise, or a corporate business that's a limited company. They can also, have social benefits. We're working to do events with B Corps and set up a B Corp network locally, so that all businesses are thinking about what the social impacts are. I think that's the key point. So, but happy to take any others.
Brilliant. Can I just check in on sort of recommendations we picked up? So we've got one about, do you mind if I read over your? Yeah. We've got one about trade union membership, both in terms of the Economic Steering Board and also in terms of mentioning them in the document as a whole. So it might be worth splitting those up into 2 recommendations. And then the inclusion of biodiversity in strategy as a success indicator. Do you want that as a recommendation still? And the mention of a third sector, just making sure that that's in there as a recommendation. And then we had another one about a way of demonstrating how competing priorities have been assessed, but I think Councillor Brown might have addressed that in her point, unless you wanted that to stay as a recommendation.
I mean, I think it'd be quite useful for it to be a recommendation. Yeah.
Okay, we'll keep that in there. And then I think I will take hands again, and I think I might take these as the last contributions, because it is 8 o'clock and we've got another item to consider. So I'll take all 4 at once. So I'll take Councillor Qureshi, Councillor Sanderson, and then Councillor Hunt, then Councillor Betty Summers. That's okay.
Okay, I will try to be very briefly. The first question I would like is, I see in the report to speak about the new community wealth building innovation pilot in Blackpool East, Littlemore and Rosehill. I tried to find more about in this report, but I would like to know a little more about that. Okay. The second point is, unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know, cities at the moment we have a lot of challenge, and our leader said about when we starting doing this document or the Oxford Academy strategy is before COVID, and we have COVID. We can say is a challenge and really struggling moments. Of course, now we have a Ukraine war. One of the big challenges we have now for the cities is really to produce the food in the cities. Okay, I don't see, maybe it's my fault in this document, anything about that. For example, we have a good examples. For example, in Denmark, they are produce a lot of vegetables, vertical, and so on. I know, of course, this is something we need to promote and incentivize the private sector, but how the city council could do for really this new challenge, or the real challenge of produce their food in the cities, can introduce in this document or not. Thank you very much.
Councillor Sanderson.
Thank you. First of all, an observation from the presentation that Ms. Anderson, is that correct? Who mentioned that there was already 99% employment in Oxford. So how that weighs against the increasing need for jobs in the city. The other thing is, I appreciate you expressing the tension between the need for more housing and the benefits would be undone by additional commuters being pulled in by new employment. Suggestion is that, acknowledging the tension between these two goals, that maybe one could note the current ratio of the number of working age people living in Oxford and the number of jobs provided by its employees. And there's already a series of numerical metrics. These are KPIs, key performance indicators, and that ratio should be one of them. And also to assess the impact on that ratio of the North Oxford, South Oxfordshire Science Village and West End developments, all of which provide hundreds to thousands of units of housing, but also thousands of new jobs, suggesting they may be neutral to net negative in this respect. So we can set out an explicit long-term goal for this metric and see how it should be reached.
Councillor Hunt.
Great, thanks. Well, it was just a few things that I picked up on in terms of detail, which I feel is missing, and things that are slightly unclear. I mean, certainly going back to what Evelyn's been talking about, and what we all have to focus on is the environment. And I think in a week where they've talked about planetary collapse, this is where the language has now reached. We have to be very, very concerned, really. I mean, it's not enough to talk about attention. We really have to look at what we're doing to preserve and protect. So a few things, I think, rather than talking about creating green spaces, we really need to talk about protecting green spaces, and that is a recommendation. I'd also like to see, in terms of the city centre, the fact that we are going to be pedestrianising Broad Street. I mean, whether you want to say that's pending or a consultation, but we've waited 25 years. It has to happen, so let's make it happen. I also think, in terms of what we're doing as a city to get us moving, and this connects again the economy, every tech company that comes here, they all want to cycle to work. We need to have cycle support. And I think, if I sent this to Susan today actually, but when you look at what Hackney and local boroughs are putting out in terms of detail, shared mobility growth, car clubs, cargo bike, e-bike, scooter hub, there's so much detail that we could actually be packing into a report like this, which is about our overall vision. Another point, just where is the housing going? I think that's come up again and again, and the critical word there is where. We have grey sites, we have all sorts of areas that should be built on, and we have many areas that should not be built on. Going back to this need to protect green spaces. Coming in again on food, this was brought up at the meeting I attended last week, the group meeting. We have 2 farms apparently. We need to be growing produce for the children. This is vital. We need to look into this. Again, yes, air quality, something that you bring up. You also, you mentioned donut economics, but I think what's not happening in this report is connecting all of this to show actually what we're going to do in terms of
as I said, our green spaces and putting the environment at the heart of all of our planning.
Thank you. And Councillor Betty Summers.
Yes, thank you for the report. Well, what I'm going to say might be a bit contentious, but that's okay. So the zero emission zone, I wanted to talk about it. So £10 per day in 2022, £20 per day in 2025, 52 multiplied by 20 go over 1,000 per year for the workers who are working in the town centre. And we know there are lots of workers here who are only paid a minimum wage, a living wage, and sometimes an Oxford living wage. So what do you think is going to happen? These people commute from outside the town. They are not necessarily living here because they are key workers. They don't have access to £400,000 to buy a house unless they live with their parents. So what do we think is going to happen with these people? Are they going to move out, find a job somewhere else? And why are we not more passionate about providing for these people, the workers in the town centre, more cheap and reliable and public transport that we can rely on and was very cheap. So why are we not more passionate about that? Shall we talk a bit more about that?
Can I just jump in quickly? I think just in the interest of time, because we've got another big report that we need to cover, I'm going to suggest, I think there are quite a few, I don't know the exact specifics, but quite a few things that were raised in that fall under the scope of other work that the council's doing. And because this is an overarching report, obviously it touches on a lot of things that the City Council is doing and working on. And you can completely disregard what I say, but I'm going to suggest that if that is the case, you explain that's the case and address the key issues that are to do with the report we've got in front of us, because otherwise we could be here, because there are lots of interesting discussions to be had, but I think otherwise we could be here all night. Councillor Hunt, very quickly.
The point, which was that we cannot write a report like this without talking about Brexit. I mean, the fact is we are a global city, but we have been decimated by Brexit. And what I'm hearing all the time is about staff shortages. The swimming pool is not open beyond 1 PM. There's no staff. The cafe is closing, there's no staff. The airports aren't working, there's no staff. So, to talk about this sort of glut of jobs, this glut of people wanting to work here, you have to then square that off with the fact that we've got this massive shortage of employees. And, I just think it's dishonest not to be actually referring to that when you're talking about what's happening with our economy.
Okay. If I may, I'll try and address sort of whistle-stop 2 or 3 of them. I'm going to leave Matt to talk about the community wealth building project, and indeed, we may wish to give you a further update outside the meeting to save time. Both you and Jemima, Tiago, mentioned food production, and I think it's a fair point. But we have got a food strategy that is currently being worked on. And what we have tried not to do in this particular strategy document is replicate work that is being done elsewhere. So the city has got a food strategy that is being developed, and that in itself feeds into the county wide food strategy. Those are both incredibly important pieces of work, and I don't wish to underestimate them in any way or the importance of that. And of course, that does have an impact on our economy, but I think it's just a separate piece of work, and therefore that's why it's not in this document. Joe, you referred to, I thought I heard you say you refer to hundreds of thousands of housing units, but was it hundreds or thousands, or? Because it certainly isn't hundreds of thousands of housing, if only it were. Okay, hundreds to thousands, right. Yeah, so I mean, there are many different ways in which we can look at this. I think I just want to emphasise yet again that this document isn't about creating the housing. It's not about creating the jobs. It's reflecting on how we manage the jobs and the housing that is planned for and that is coming anyway, to make sure that it is done in the best possible way, and providing the best possible service, if you like, to the people of Oxford. So the next issues were the ones Jemima raised around the things such a lot of transport issues essentially around Broad Street and car clubs and transport. And again, I would say this document is reflecting the fact that work is being done to support some move to more sustainable ways of transport, but this isn't a transport strategy. So, you know, that work is being done by the County Council, the Transport Authority. We're reflecting in this economic strategy the fact that we will reap some of the advantages of work that's being done on that, and reflecting again the importance of sustainable transport. And you also raised housing, and again, I would just say this document is not about determining where housing is. That is determined elsewhere in the local plan document. So, you know, this economic strategy cannot talk about that because it is just not relevant effectively. Then finally, the points that Nadine made about the ZEZ, I would again sort of say to some extent that is not for this document or for this discussion really. It is something that's been consulted on. It's something that is already in place, but again, the point that I have made several times is that employment in the city centre is about as sustainable as you can get in terms of transport, and there are many different ways of getting into the city centre if you're commuting other than by private car. So I think that's an important point to make. So if we're talking about people commuting into the city centre, I do think there are a number of different options for people.
I'll just add really briefly, the point on Brexit is a good one. You know, we're really seeing that filter through into the labour market. Yeah. We've removed any mention of jobs estimates in the strategy. We recognise there are jobs being created, and the challenge is making sure that people who are working in the city or commuting into the city can fill those jobs or have the right skills to fill those jobs, and that they're adequately paid. It's too uncertain at the moment to try and project what those jobs will be, and we haven't done it in the economic strategy. Projecting growth is something that's done in the local plan. It's not something that we are promoting. It's about how we respond to what's happening to produce sustainable outcomes as possible and inclusive outcomes. On community wealth building, I didn't add that we use that Friends Provident funding to employ a community wealth building officer 3 days a week. They're working closely with our colleagues and with other community development organisations to try and evangelize and support a community wealth building approach. As Susan said, it's a challenge to do so, but we've made that commitment working with the previous co-op champion to do so, and we'll continue to do so. We're looking to how we can support community wealth building as a long-term approach. We can provide a briefing on that, but it's certainly something that we want to see as a thread running through the strategy over the next 10 years.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, everyone. So I'm just going to clarify the recommendations we've got before do we then need to, what do we do next? And then we just need to agree the recommendations basically. We've got the ones that we've already sort of mentioned and agreed, and then the new ones are, there was one point raised by Councillor Sanderson about the additional KPI and the ratio of working age people in Oxford, number of jobs. Then we had there's one suggested one from Councillor Hunt about protecting green spaces rather than creating, but I think that might be more of one for something to do with I'm not sure that that's necessarily specific enough for this report. Okay, we'll have that as a.
Can I just give a little bit of officer advice on that? So the open spaces in the city are protected through the local plan. So the local plan is supported by a very detailed evidence base, auditing every piece of open space in this city and identifying which can be developed and which should be protected, which should be enhanced. So I don't think it is appropriate for an economic strategy to do things about land use ultimately. Local plan is more than a land use plan, but it is ultimately fundamentally a land use plan. So anything about where housing goes, this economic strategy, as an example, is not trying to say which employment sites we should protect or not protect. It can't even do that because that is for the local plan. And it's local plan who has to strike that balance that we were talking about
this strategy is all about influencing others, whether that be government or local stakeholders or business or communities to act and against those 3 pillars. So that I think if as a recommendation, it just needs to be aware of that.
I think that's really helpful. I mean, I think my inclination would not be to include that recommendation, because I think it is a matter for the local plan, one of which already exists and obviously goes through extensive consultation, and obviously starting conversation on the next one at all, which I'm right now, which I'm sure will also come before this committee as the 2050 Oxfordshire plan did. Then we had just a suggestion so I'd suggest removing the protecting green spaces one, but then we had one of mentioning the pedestrianisation of Broad Street as a recommendation, and also making sure that there's a mention of Brexit and the challenges. Is that already in the?
It's in there.
Okay, fantastic. Then we can remove which one, the pedestrianisation one or the Brexit one?
The pedestrianisation of Broad Street is in the city centre action plan.
Okay, fantastic. In which case, yeah, fantastic. Is everyone happy with those in that list?
I personally do think that I do understand the local plan talks about where and number of houses, but this economic strategy does mention about by 2030, I think 2,500 houses needed to build. So this gives over sort of head towards the lower plan. So this does talk about, so therefore I think mentioning
I think it does. I think we've acknowledged that it does discuss that, but it's not the document that determines it's, and I think it makes clear in the document itself that it's only discussing sites which are already documented for that specific.
Talking about
can you
sites
can
here,
you can okay. That's
I think it may have been sites, houses that were targets that were going to be created by Oxford City Housing Limited, I think, if I remember correctly. So it was on sites where there would be a plan for delivering them and trying to deliver them as low carbon as possible. I think it was that. Yeah.
The more something's open to interpretation, just going back to create and protect.
I think this is a really good question, and I get the point. I think there's a couple of things we've done within the strategy to try and manage that. We've showed how this links with national policy, how it links with local policy, and also county-wide policy, because obviously we have the county-wide economic policy through the LEP as well. And it also articulates the council's role and the limits to that. The council's role can be as a doer on projects like Owned by Oxford, which I've mentioned, or Meanwhile in Oxfordshire, working with others. But in other areas, it's simply an influencer. And that influence, as we mentioned with the colleges, sometimes is not as much as we'd like. So that influence role is one of the challenging areas, but it's one of the important areas, because that's really where the impact is. So it isn't by any means a Bible, but it is about how we try and guide a more sustainable approach to economic development. So perhaps there is a need to make that very, very clear in terms of what the limits of our role are and why we need to work in partnership to make this happen.
I think one of the points that I meant to make earlier on was that I felt that a lot of the recommendations or thoughts that were being reflected back from scrutiny were more about the kind of powers that people wished we had than that we actually do have. So I would absolutely agree with what Matt has said. I mean, I think this is much more about soft power, Jemima. It's much more about how we are seeking to influence discussions in the city. It reflects, wherever it's appropriate, existing or actually Bibles like the local plan. I mean, that is a kind of document that is, goes through a massively complicated consultation process and is a statutory document. This is not in the same way that kind of document, and the discussions around land use are just not appropriate for this document. This isn't the place to have that discussion. That should be happening around the local plan.
Brilliant. Thank you. Does that clarify things, and are we happy to move forward with that list of recommendations? Brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you both for taking such a chunk of your time and listening to all of our questions. So next we've got the City Centre Action Plan. So I'm going to invite Councillor Thomas to come up and introduce that.
Hello. Yeah, thanks. Welcome to the new Scrutiny Committee. I will be as brief as possible because I'm aware we don't have much time and I want to leave time for questions. So this hopefully will be familiar to a lot of you. It's work that was begun quite a while ago in 2019 and had to be delayed because of the pandemic. But that does mean there's been a lot of time for stakeholder engagements, for councillors to be aware of it. I know some city centre ward councillors will be very familiar with this already and will already have fed back, and for our city centre task force to get involved. So beyond just the consultation that you'll see here, there's been a lot of engagement with a lot of different groups. And that's very fitting because it is a community-owned plan that is open-ended and encourages feedback going forwards and flexibility, because we know that the city centre today is not the city centre of 2 years ago, but also not the city centre of 10 years ago. And we don't quite know what will happen in the next 5-10 years. So it's important that we're taking that approach, that flexible approach. This one, I mean, it has a lot in common and it links very strongly to the last report we just had. So I'm glad that we have them together in a lot of ways. I'm also, I would stress that it's more of a way of making sense of a lot of things that are already happening, adding some kind of structure, some momentum, some ownership to some of that work, as well as proposing new ideas. So it's that sort of mix. And like the last report, it's also adapting to things we know are going to happen, but aren't entirely within the council's control. So where the council might be taking leadership of creating this plan, it is something that will have to be implemented in partnership with our anchor institutions, with stakeholders, with tenants in the centre, with residents, and we'll need that constant feedback. The structure I hope has been helpful with these 4 work streams that we can then break down into our objectives, which you can scrutinise. And then within those, there are different projects. That does make it a huge thing for us to answer questions on. So especially on the specifics. So we'll do our best, and I'm sure I'll be falling back on that quite a lot there. I want to stress, especially with my new role, the commitments on the environment, trying to really kind of pin down those ways to reach our ambitious targets, to reach net zero, to increase biodiversity, to make the city a greener place where people can take a break, children can play, and where travellers are safe, active travellers are safe. We're approving here changes as a result, we're talking about making recommendations on changes as a result of consultation, 2 of which I'd like to highlight. This is one of them I've mentioned before, responding to uncertainties, this idea that it should be a living document that's flexible, that's adaptive. So that was really valuable feedback we got in the consultation process, and has been taken on board, I'm glad to see. Also, the art and culture offer diverse. We've got a lot of enthusiasm about live music, and that's been taken on board as well. I'll hand over to Matt if he has anything to add, because I know we don't have much time.
I think you covered it well, Councillor Thomas. I would just say that we got a good response from the consultation, 398 responses to that consultation, which was good. And the positives again that were each of those elements of the SWOT analysis, the strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats, again were pretty much well supported. And those 4 themes that Imogen mentioned around getting the basics right, getting the mix right, ensuring that connectivity and access is as strong as possible, were supported as well. And of course, public realm seen as something that was very, very important within the responses that we got as well, but also something that's challenging to deliver in a city centre like Oxford. No fundamental major changes were suggested. There was very much a suggestion that there's so much uncertainty around city centres. We need to treat this as a living document, a flexible document, and review it as we go, and review that very closely with a strong delivery board. So there was a need for good governance that has city centre stakeholders involved. There was a recognition that we need to engage residents on a ongoing basis, probably an annual basis, regarding the city centre action plan as well. A recognition we needed to add the Castle Quarter as an area, as a street in the back of the plan where there's potential for change and improvement. As I said, public realm important, arts and culture and live music important, and making clear what the spatial extent of the city centre is. And again, that's following the local plan definition of the city centre. Obviously, we engage with businesses in areas just outside, but it's not in the area of the strategy. Doesn't mean we don't support those businesses, but it's not the area for action that we're identifying. And I think being explicit around the reference to colleges and green space was something that was suggested as well. Yes, and greening of the city centre as well. Looking at opportunities to do that was a very clear thing that came through the engagement as well. But other than that, very much supported. It is about how we go about delivering that ambition, have strong governance from different stakeholders in the city centre. We're planning, once hopefully the city centre action plan is adopted, to meet with city centre stakeholders and get their buy-in to the delivery board approach, because we need other city centre stakeholders to deliver. Otherwise, the city centre action plan can only have some impact with our influence. It needs other partners on board. So I think that's a key message for this document, that we need others to support it.
Thanks very much both, and welcome Councillor Thomas to your first scrutiny committee as a cabinet member rather than a member of the committee. And yeah, I'll just open it up to sort of questions and comments from the committee. Just seeing one at the moment, so I'll take Councillor Pegg, hopefully spark some more.
Yeah, I had one thing that was a question, which was on the stats about office vacancies. It says they've been low for the last 5 years. Is that still a post-COVID figure? It seems surprising if that does take into account COVID. And then the second point was there's a massive focus on hotels in this, and building more hotels and more spaces for people, for tourists to stay. And whilst I understand we want to boost the tourism economy, we also need to build houses. And if that's space that's suitable for development, shouldn't we be having more of the focus on building genuinely affordable homes, not hotels?
If you could come in the first one. On the second, in terms of hotels, I think we really need to be increasing overnight stays, and I hope that the Green Party would accept that. People travelling in by private car is probably a much, and then leaving the next day, coming in by bus and leaving the next day, and going to London or to another place. If people can be coming to Oxford, staying for a week, being pedestrian while they're there, getting there in public transport, I think that's something that hotels encourage, as well as boosting the economy and some of the other positive effects. I think there's definitely an environmental argument to be made there. I'd also want to stress that we have a problem and that this council has campaigned successfully on in terms of short-term lets. So we're talking about websites such as Airbnb that are very unregulated, that don't have the same safety requirements, that are pricing people out of the private rented sector and causing a lot of problems for people looking for a home and for kind of the stability to know where their family is going to be living. So hotels also help to fight that social problem, and the city centre is a really good place to put them. So I actually think that I'm really proud to see them as part of this. And if Matt could answer the other point.
Yeah, on the office space, those figures do need an update. And so what we're seeing with office space is essentially still the same in the city centre, that there is very limited office space available. We don't really have an area where there are offices of sufficient quality. There are a few offices available, but they're relatively small, they're relatively out of date. What we're finding in terms of the market that's happening is that those that are relatively large office occupiers are rationalizing their space. They're taking typically, somewhere between a third or 2/3 of what they had previously, but they are then looking for high quality office space, collaboration space. They're looking for flexible space that they can scale up and scale down in. And that's very much one of the things we're recommending in both strategies, that we need to create more flexible workspace. Where we do create that, hopefully we can create that on existing sites, which we're looking at with Standingford House and Cave Street, just outside the city centre, but also George Street in the city centre, using existing premises for flexible office space that will have a long-term need. And then, of course, there are going to be big changes in the way office space is used. That's not filtered through yet. So we need that flexibility. We're seeing some of the large retail centres coming forward for lab space. So again, we're lucky in a city like Oxford that there are demands from other sectors to use our existing buildings where they've got the right sorts of configuration and height that they can be used for things like labs as well. So we need to feel our way and what that balance is around office space. But what we are seeing at the moment is very much increasing rentals that are locking out businesses, that are less well funded than some of the sort of spin outs that have got different series of investment funding. And what we need to try and do is create affordable space alongside some of that more high value space as well. So that's a key element of this plan and the economic strategy as well. But it is very much in flux.
I'll just come in on the hotels point again, and that I completely agree with what Councillor Thomas has said. And I would just, I would echo again the huge danger that short-term lets are to, affordable housing in the city, because if a landlord thinks that they can, or sees that they can earn, in some cases, far more money renting out a house short term than they can renting it out long term to families or working people in the city, that's definitely something that's going to far more eat into our housing stock. And the other thing I'd say is certainly some of the sites that I think are being converted to hotels in the city centre. I mean, this isn't the case for all of them, I'm not saying that, but a lot of them are ones where you wouldn't be able to build flats or affordable housing anyway, because they wouldn't have any windows. And that, while that might be okay for a week stay, and I've stayed in weird hotels that don't have any windows, and it's fine because you're really only sleeping there so you can explore the city, you wouldn't want that as housing for anyone. So I just add that point to the mix as well. Sorry.
I was just going to say, Councillor, you're absolutely right. And in some cases, just as an example to give you a flavour, so 1-3 George Street that Matt referenced, it's going to be affordable workspace, was originally looked at by the City Council for housing, but it wasn't possible to meet building regulations and space requirements for housing. And Boswell's is another example of that, where you wouldn't be able to get right to light to meet our own amenity requirements. So it's not so there will be instances, and I think the strategy does still say we want to look at improving a residential population within the city, as well as longer stays, because one of the things obviously we saw in the pandemic with the city centre was it was heavily impacted by the fact that it in and of itself does not have a very big resident population. But that may be that in the city centre, as the local plan identifies, it is one of the more appropriate locations for student accommodation, for example, and Northgate House is an example of that, to bring some vibrancy in also what is ultimately quite a noisy and busy environment a lot of the time to live in.
Thanks very much. I saw a hand from Councillor Hunt. Are there any other hands before? I can't see any, so go ahead.
I was just going to ask, what's very slightly sad about the centre of Oxford at the moment is it's been so denuded of, there's the Westgate, which is a separate issue. We won't go there. That's been built. So, we now have the High Street, where a shop like Space NK only lasted a year, 2 years. If you want to shop at a Space NK, you've got to either go to London or to Cheltenham, which is interesting because those are two shopping places. Oxford is not traditionally a shopping city, which also leads me to my point about independent shops, because when you look at the small market towns or the towns that have thrived, bigger market towns, during the pandemic and post, Norwich is a great example. Norwich has got pedestrianised city centre. It kept hold of Gerald's, which was its Boswell's, a fabulous independent family-run department store. The loss of Boswell's, I think, is tragic. It then, has the market, which we now have the covered market, which is fabulous. Again, you then want to be able to spill out from the market down to Broad Street with, tables, more food. That's the sort of food bit now, but so then I feel there needs to be a vision for the High Street as you walk up. It's still got these old sort of 1980s shops that must thrive, which is great, but then just so many empty shops. And then Core Market Street with 2 of those terrible American sweet shops that are a tax dodge. I mean, if you've read Your Private Eye, they're a tax dodge. We shouldn't be allowing them. And all the dessert places that now keep opening, which again, I just feel there has to be a cap on the number of places to go and have a sort of £8 cheesecake.
I love Jemima's vision, and I do think it aligns very closely with the action plan. Fortunately, if you go to page 66, you'll see visions for High Street. If you go to page 58, you'll see visions for Core Market. You make some really good points about pedestrianisation. There is very little reason to drive a private car to the centre of Oxford, with a few important exceptions to that rule in terms of disability. And pedestrianisation of Broad Street. I work on Broad Street. I really enjoyed seeing Broadmeadow. I wanted that to go further, and that's exactly the work that is being done. And you'll find that in the action plan as well. You talked about kind of the mix of shops, and I think that's one of really getting the mix right. Number 3, a very, very big kind of pillar of this plan. And it's definitely something we're looking at going forward, those meanwhile uses, getting a mix of kind of independent shops, also not just the high-end stuff that some landowners might push for, but also some of the kind of cheaper stores that I think residents really are after. And we saw queues outside of just shortly following lockdowns. So it's responding to feedback that we've all had on the doorstep. And I'm in a city centre ward, so it's close to my heart. But thank you, Jemima, for sharing your vision, and I hope that you'll find it reflected in the plan.
I totally agree with that. I think getting the mix right is one of the more challenging elements of the strategy, I think, because City Council as a landlord does have space in the city, but it has to try and get best value for the council. But we need to address that in the best way possible. But we also need to work with other landlords as well to see if we can get relative agreement over how we can promote positive uses in the city. But it's a difficult challenge for us to do, and we have to work our way through that. It's a real partnership effort, and also something where we need to just try and build consensus on what the vision is for the historic core of the city as well. What is it as a destination, and how do we go about building that consensus in a way that but then becomes something that's marketed to potential occupiers, so they identify with the destination in that way. So that's an ongoing challenge, but it requires coordination among landlords and occupiers as well. So partnership is absolutely key to this.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. I think it's a brilliant report. Oh, fantastic. I'm just going to check. There weren't any, have I missed any recommendations? I think they've mainly been kind of comments and questions, but if anyone who's spoken wanted to propose anything as a recommendation just before I take Councillor Mundy's point. Not seeing any. Okay, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask about the consultation and the responses from individuals, and whether you're satisfied with the ethnic diversity of the respondents, and if not, if there was anything that could have been done better.
Residents, I would have to look in it in more detail to get you the detail, but I think we had exactly the same issue in that it was relatively low for younger groups and BAME groups. I don't think it was as significant as the economic strategy, but I think it was the same issue, and we see it a lot of our consultations. We made efforts to use the residents panel, and I think the lesson across the 2 consultations is that you need to make it accessible, and that is the challenge. And also, we tried that with residents forums across both of these, but we didn't get the buy-in to the residents forum. The residents forum were going to be very much about just tell us your vision, but we didn't get people there. So the challenge is how you get people there, how you engage them, and we need to, as we've all said, work harder at that. And there is an opportunity for this city centre action plan to have an annual attempt at that through the way we review and monitor the strategy and check progress. I don't think we have the resource to do any more than that, but that's something we can look to do the right way.
Yeah, I was going to say, could we pop that in as a recommendation, maybe around maybe we could have 2, one around, the sort of, if it's going to be sort of iterative or adaptive as a plan, maybe having the same approach to consultation and making sure that, again, like the previous recommendation, is done in a range of ways to ensure it's inclusive, but also to kind of, on a separate point, to make sure that we're really reflecting on the diversity of the consultation responses we're receiving, and again having an adaptive approach to that consultation where we need to try and get that make sure it's reflective of our city. Yeah,
One thing I was just going to say on that was one of the things we can do, and I don't know if you want to build it into your recommendation, is we talk about in the governance and delivery section of the City Centre Action Plan about doing kind of annual resident kind of updates about progress and kind of the living document piece. So we can obviously focus in on trying to make that group as representative of the city as a whole, not just the city centre, which is part of what we were trying to do through the wider engagement, actually, is not just talk to people who are in the city centre, but actually people who use the city centre. It's always one of those challenges. What I would say is where we've done projects in the city centre, both around the Covered Market and Broad Street, we get a lot more uptake of engagement. I think it's something that people can grab hold of and kind of focus in on. So when we, for example, did consultation on with transition by design on the Covered Market, that was where we gathered some of the learning actually about what wasn't attractive to some of our more diverse communities and deprived communities about the city centre. So it was the high-end retail, it was the fact that there's not a lot to do in the city centre that's free and not, you know, that's not outside of, that's essentially outside of museums and feelings of accessibility into the university. People don't feel like they can approach to go into colleges, etc., etc. So we do quite targeted engagement like that. But it is harder, I would say, on a strategy. And I think it's just don't get too drawn in by the consultation portal responses, because it is very common across the board of the council to get kind of very poor. But that's why we have done the other workshops as well. But we can't. I wonder whether or not, if you wanted to, your recommendation could be focused on the representation in a similar way to the Economic Growth Steering Board of that annual resident engagement.
Yeah, I think that would be a really good idea. And I guess, is there a way that, I mean, it might be that I've missed it in the reports as well, but is there a way to build in the reports themselves some of the work that's done on a workshop basis, if that makes sense? Because then I guess that would be, because those obviously do pick up very different people and provide a very different set of helpful answers. And I guess another recommendation might be, you know, about kind of physical forms of, if not consultation in the formal sense, getting people's ideas, because I know that probably I might have been accidentally talking cross purposes, because I'm thinking of consultation as something very broad, whereas obviously there is statutory consultation that has to happen. So I guess I think there might be a couple of recommendations in there, including the one you suggested, just about kind of making sure that those, I guess, the work that's being done is also being reflected in the report, even if it can't be done in a very formal way, because it's not through the official consultation portal, but is reflecting the work we're doing. Because I think a lot of questions have been around that. But if that's obviously already work that we're doing, it would be good to kind of share in a more loud way if we can.
Yeah, we can talk about what we've attempted. I mean, I can't guarantee that even on the attendance even at some of the resident kind of workshops we established wasn't great. And that's what I mean about strategy. The other thing I would say that we do as offices is obviously we work quite closely with other parts of the council. So both our communities team, so we have obviously our locality officers who we kind of engage with, who are and we engage with locality officers across the city to kind of get a feel of some of that. And that's how, for example, we designed the engagement on the Covered Market that we did. So we can talk about that, Councillor Diggins, in the report, that we don't just rely on what people tell us through a consultation portal to develop this. And obviously we're talking to quite a diverse range of businesses in the city centre who actually, because they're hospitality and leisure businesses, have a very diverse workforce and have some quite unique challenges in the sense that, you know, across all things, even transport, for example, where, you know, you're working long shifts, or, you know, you're doing things where buses drop off in terms of frequency and all that kind of things. And when we feed all that back into conversations we have with bus operators and things, but we can potentially talk a little bit more about that in the consultation report, add a couple of paragraphs to give a flavour, but it's very hard to quantify it. That's the problem.
Yeah, I think I was not talking about, because I understand it's hard to quantify, but I think because obviously when we hear businesses we've been discussing in the report, in the committee, that's often maybe seen as kind of not necessarily including those hospitality shift workers, for example. So I think just a paragraph outlining that it does would be really helpful. Just finally, I think I saw Councillor Hunt's hand.
Yeah, it was just a point about, I was thinking again about Cornmarket Street or Road, whatever it is, but that huge now block that Jesus College have built. And obviously, again, there's a sense in which, the colleges are property developers and just, have carte blanche. And which leads me to my question about the arrangement, the relationship that the City Council has with the colleges as landlords, because surely there has to be a conversation about the fact that we've reached a crisis in terms of, I think there's 25 empty shops, maybe some are owned by the council, I don't know, but how can we encourage pop-ups or small businesses, independent businesses to come to Oxford? Because what's interesting, you go to Cambridge, I don't think Cambridge has got half as many empty shops at the moment, but it has all the same franchises. I mean, it's identikit, which, Bristol's not like this, Norwich is, and again, these other cities which have got independent stores that we should really, really try and bring, foster.
Yeah, I'll come back briefly. I'm sure Matt can add to what I say. I used to live in Bristol and I do love the feel of it. They are very different cities in terms of the challenges we face, and in terms of the way the universities are integrated into them historically, especially. I think a lot of the work is being done in terms of discussing on strategies around leasing and trying to influence, and it's a very difficult job. I won't lie there. I think the council and officers do an absolutely brilliant job of using the opportunities they do have. And one thing we can do is to lead by example. Where we do have influence over leasing strategies, such as in the covered markets, if we're encouraging the kind of qualitative rather than quantitative ways of thinking about things, if we're encouraging independent shops, meanwhile uses, if we're looking at what residents want rather than just...
I mean, I'll give you a very good example. I would like there to be a pet shop in the town. I would like to be able to cycle into town and get my dog biscuits and not have to drive out, or God forbid, cycle out to Temple bloody Cowley.
I think it would be great if we have contributions coming through the chair as well. But I'm going to say that I think a lot of this is actually what the plan is about. So I'm going to say that maybe it's best to leave it there. Unless there was any other very pressing points before we sort of agree those recommendations. I think we've kind of covered them all before, but if anyone wants clarification before we close up the meeting, I'm happy to give that. Fantastic. I'm sorry it is. I'm sorry it's so late. We've just got to approve the dates of future meetings, noting that as we agreed earlier, the housing panel will be moved to a date in September.
My recommendation.